Hi everyone, I'm Amber Fennell. I'm partner and co-founder here at Consilium Strategic Communications. And it just gives me so much pleasure to see so many of you in person today. It is our industry that is the reason why we are able to be here. And I just want to take a moment just to process that and just say how incredible it has been that we are now here in person. 2 years ago when I stood here, I think I said something like, this industry is so integral to everything that we do, and the last, obviously, year and a half, it's become even more so. Not only the companies obviously working in vaccines, but also the treatments that are needed just for normal healthcare. And so many of you in companies have had to adapt, be agile, and move in a different way during the last 18 months to ensure that obviously all those great development and innovation can carry on. So curating a conference against this backdrop, especially when it's been moving so incredibly quickly, and also because we had to start so early in the year, has been quite difficult. But hopefully today I will see it as a success. If you come away with a little bit more process in your head, you've been able to think about some of the themes and hear from some of these fantastic speakers that we have today, from their experiences and learn from that. So our first panel will look at kind of the new normal and what we should take from the past 18 months, what should we keep, what went well, what didn't. And we also look at how we fund that and fund innovation. And as you know, over the past year, there's been a huge rise in SPACs. That's kind of come back a bit, but it'd be interesting to hear from Eduardo at LSP, especially on his experience there. And also the third panel, and a topic that's really close to our hearts, is obviously the communications element of our industry. So we saw obviously COVID give us a great chance to almost elevate the industry beyond anyone could ever imagine. I was speaking to friends yesterday and they know who Beyond Tech are, whereas 2 years ago they'd have just looked at me with a puzzled face. So how do we capitalize on that, on the positivity that our industry has been able to create? Before we kick off, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Consilium, because obviously we have had the most incredible year as well. So many of our clients have been obviously to do with COVID, or they've been, as I say, trying to just continue to operate in quite difficult conditions. And because of that, we've expanded, and there'll be a lot of new faces around. We are all wearing these purple lanyards. So if you see someone and you don't know who they are, please do go and say hi. They hopefully will come and say hi to you. But I'm so proud, both of us, all of us are so proud of our team. They've been incredible over the last 18 months and working in, as all of you have been, in quite crazy conditions, but come out the other side. Although Richard Marsden will continue to tell me that we are still in the thick of it. COVID is not obviously over, but obviously we have had, some tough times, but some really brilliant times. And we're so proud to represent so many of our clients in this industry. I want to thank Citi, Cooley and Stiefel. They've been our enduring sponsors for many years. They've helped us when we did the online version last year. And they've stayed with us this year, and it's fantastic. They're all here, so if you don't know them, please do spend some time getting to know them. And of course, Notified, who have kindly sponsored us, so that we've got about 100 registered on the webcast. So thank you for them as well. COVID-19 safety, I do have to just obviously remind you, thank you everyone for taking your tests before you come. Masks aren't obviously obligatory, but do please feel free to wear them, especially if it gets crowded. There is various guidance all over the building, so please do pay attention to that. Everyone should have a complimentary sanitizer. Please do use it. If you want to ask a question, please can you sanitize your hands before and after using the microphone. On questions, we will be taking questions from the room first, and then if you're online, please do ask questions. We will be reading them out. Andrew has a whizzy little iPad, and he will be looking at those as they come through. We have a break at 2:35, and we've also got drinks at 4:30, so please do stick around if you can. Thank you all again so much for being here in person. It means a lot to us, and it's just great, so great to see you all here. I'll now hand over to Jessica, who's going to introduce our first panel.
Thanks, Amber, and hi, everybody. It's great to see so many faces here. So I'm delighted to introduce this panel, which is called The New Normal. And obviously, this industry has faced seismic changes, as has the whole world over the past 2 years. Everything from the way clinical trials are designed and managed, to government intervention in healthcare, to accelerated regulatory timetables. And this has created a new normal for our world. I think what this panel seeks to do is to evaluate which of the changes that have happened to the industry should remain, which we should reject, and essentially how we move forward in a way that takes the best of that world with us. We think this is a uniquely well-qualified panel to talk about this. So we've got, from immediately next to me, Dima Kuzmin, partner at 4Bio Capital. We've got John Malad, CEO of Quanta Dialysis Technologies. Next to John, we have John Dawson, CEO of Oxford Biomedica. Angela McFarlane, Vice President for Strategic Planning, Northern Europe, IQVIA. And then next to Angela, we have Richard Marsden, CEO of Synergen. And finally, moderating the panel, we have Andrew Baum, who is Global Head of Healthcare at Citi. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew.
Well, thank you. We haven't done anything yet, but by all means, clap. So look, delighted to be here, and I'm really very grateful for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think for many of us, including myself, this is the first live event that we've done in almost 2 years, and it's so refreshing to have human beings rather than a Zoom screen in front of us. I'm also very grateful that I wasn't allowed to start hosting a real estate panel on the floor beneath, which was very, very close to reality at one point. So it's good that I'm in the right room at least. So we have a tremendous panel for you today, and what makes it interesting is the background of the individuals. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but coming from both a drug discovery and development, coming from a manufacturing, coming from an investing point of view, coming from a device point of view. So we have a little bit of everything to try and address what's a very, very big topic. It's a big panel, so I'm going to respectfully ask that individuals try to contain answers, despite, I'm sure, a lot of enthusiasm and passion. But perhaps just to kick off, and maybe you could introduce yourself as part of answering the question. Taking the pandemic as a whole, and as you think about the broader impact on the industry, what do you think is the one key learning for you and your business that we or you should take out of it? And I'll start with Richard. Why don't we start with you?
Okay, so introductions-wise, I'm Richard Marsden. I'm CEO of Synergen, and we're developing a therapeutic, which is inhaled interferon beta, which we are very well into a phase 3 trial of assessing this drug in hospitalized patients. We've just completed recruitment with results coming through early next year, and the American government are funding and managing another phase 3 trial, which is assessing the drug against COVID patients outside of the hospital environment. So coming to the question, I think Amber's right. We are in the middle of this still, and I know for many of us this is the first conference we've attended in person, so we're feeling our way into the new normal. I think the one thing that will endure, because it's difficult to sort of imagine, you'd have to ask this question in 5 years' time to get good answers, but the power of people driven by the calling to arms, the emotional effort that's gone into what we're doing as a company, whether it's people in the company, the contractors we've got, people at Parexel, manufacturing people around us, and also the support infrastructure, the governmental infrastructure around the MHRA, HRA, and everything we see outside of the UK as well. So it's ordinary people who've stepped up at a moment of need for the world. I think that's the thing for me.
Thanks, Andrew. Angela McFarlane from IQVIA, as you said earlier. We are a human data science company and global leader in clinical trials and real-world evidence studies. And coming really to your question, it kind of takes me back to being a brownie in a Girl Guide before I got chucked out. Be prepared. be prepared, because disease-wise, the next pandemic is coming, and we weren't prepared for disease X, for COVID-19. I think it's fair to say one of the greatest learnings that within IQVIA we had was how important it had been to be able to mobilise the work that we'd done on being able to set up platforms for trials very quickly. We got a call from Patrick Vallance third week in March last year to say, can you set up a phase 2 treatment platform? And we had it ready by Good Friday. We had it ready because we'd done the groundwork. So I think that's really, really important. And perhaps going forward, we need to talk about the power of platforms over products, and also the lessons to be learned about the power of being able to do virtual trials, because without those virtual trials, we really would have been in a pickle. So be prepared.
Hi, John Dawson, CEO of Biomedica. I've been doing this now for about 13 years or so. And we were doing, before the pandemic, we were specialists in lentivector for cell and gene therapy, one of the 3 main vectors you can deliver these viral vectors into the body with, and the treatments. That all changed when the consortium called us up one day to talk to us about working with them on the new drug for the pandemic. So we got involved, and then AZ got involved as well after that. And then we saw our technologies and our work suddenly in the public window that we hadn't expected. So we always said to the world that lentivector was the hardest vector to make. We then switched to adenovectors, which we claimed previously had been easy to make, and thank God we succeeded, because we did. And since then we've made many, many batches. We've made tens of millions of doses and actually saved thousands of lives. So if you ever want to look at a company to how to motivate it, that's the part of it. But I would say, what have we learned about it from our perspective? First of all, working with AZ, in the consortium of manufacturers we've been part of, we did a very good job for AZ, we know we did, but we had to make sure we had materials to work with. And we saw companies, household names of companies, sharing raw materials with us, and us back with them at times when we were short. And that meant we kept going. And that was a collaboration like I've never seen before between companies, which was fantastic. And on from there, then the authorities and the government, especially the Vaccine Task Force, was so supportive of us in everything we did, but we also saw expedited approval from the MHRA virtually. They've been to see us since, but we saw these things happening like that. And my major learning from that, apart from the collaboration of the people, part of the consortium, was the communication within the company. I'd always thought we did a fair job at that. Now I speak to my team every day. I didn't before. We have a half-hour session every single day. We speak to the company probably every month, and we have great news to spread, because you go into healthcare generally because you want to save lives, and we've done a great job at doing that. So very proud of the people, done a fantastic job, and things that I didn't think were possible in scale-up for manufacturing, and we did up to 1,000 litre scale. We'd never done it before. We did all of that, and the people came through, did about 9 months' work in 4, and on from there, then we played our part in the pandemic. So for me, it is the collaboration plus the communication I've learned from.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Malad, CEO of Quanta Dialysis Technologies. I believe there are many lessons that can be learned from our experience during the pandemic. I would certainly echo everything that's been said so far, and I'd be happy to speak on that for hours, but I will contain my comments. So we, just by background, we're a UK-based innovation company that has developed a portable hemodialysis system that's designed to change the way that life-sustaining dialysis care is provided, namely by allowing much greater flexibility around where the dialysis treatments can be delivered, and making the operation of dialysis accessible to a broader range of users. So opening things up and creating the opportunity for care to be liberated from the traditional model of bricks and mortar clinics, and organizing patients needing to go to those clinics on a routine basis. And we're currently commercial in both the UK and the US. And we did our commercial launch right in the midst of the first wave of the pandemic. We also raised the largest round ever in our industry in the midst of the pandemic. One of the key lessons I would abstract from all of this is that the pandemic has demonstrated and indeed manifested the world getting smaller. It has flattened boundaries and shown that geography in particular is less important as a barrier than it has been in the past. In the sad way, it's shown us that through the spread of the pandemic, as it spread globally, and it certainly demonstrated our need to have a global response to these sorts of health crises. Secondly, it also forced upon all of us the need to consider new operating models when we all had to be shut down for a period of time. I suspect that will be one of the lingering effects of COVID, is that we've all had a forced experiment in remote working, hybrid working, and many of us found that it's not as scary as we thought it might be. In fact, there's that wonderful saying that if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. One of the things we've discovered as a company based in the Midlands, which is not necessarily where the strongest concentration of relevant talent lies for our industry, is that it's liberated us to recruit much more broadly, because it doesn't really matter if you're down the road or in another country if you're working remotely. And that's also translated into our fundraise. So in June, we were really pleased and fortunate to announce that we closed a $245 million raise, which was the largest ever in the dialysis industry. Most of the investors came from the US. They were typical crossover investors. I believe we would have, the pandemic created an opportunity for us because it meant that investors could speak to us in the UK, across the Atlantic, just as easily as they would be speaking to users of capital companies just down the road, because all those meetings were on Teams and Zoom. And so that barrier immediately disappeared. And so any smart investor looking to optimize value.
Just in the interest of time, because of the number of can we come back to the financing thing? It's an important point, but we'll revisit.
That's what it taught us. I'm sorry.
And I'm going to ask Dimitri just to hang on a second. So it's a bit like family hold back at home. The finance guys are going to eat last. But I want to introduce Sean. Sean is the Chief Commercial Officer, Chief Business Officer at BioNTech. He unfortunately can't be with us today. I suspect he's probably in the US or Germany. Sean and I have known each other probably for more than a decade. But the company has changed significantly during that time. When I last met with the CEO of BioNTech, Uga, the only meeting space that we could find in San Francisco at the JPM Healthcare Conference was Uga's bedroom. I think BioNTech doesn't have a limit on resources and getting meeting rooms right now. I think that's one thing that's definitely changed post the pandemic. Anyway, but introducing Sean. Sean, it's great to have you with us, albeit virtually. There are many things we're going to talk about, but what one thing would you say for you is the key learning, aside from the transformation brought by mRNA as a platform and vaccines in particular?
Yeah, I think it's what a lot of panelists have said, which is the key learning really is just how quickly the industry can develop emergency medicines if it puts its mind to it. And by the industry, I'm talking not only of us in the industry, but also, of course, regulators, governments, and academic institutions, all of which, for us, all played a part in our journey to getting our vaccine to the market quickly.
Thank you. And then finally, Dimitri.
Thank you. Very good to see you all again. I'm Dim, I'm the co-founding manager partner for BioCapital. We're a London-based, 200 million public fund investing across advanced therapies, primarily focused on building new and innovative companies in the UK and Europe. In terms of learnings from the pandemic, the key learning resembles slightly coming out of a financial crisis. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and the specialists got more specialized. So the pace of deployment, both for LPs and GPs during the pandemic, can be best characterized in three phases. First, panic, which lasted about a month, then a feeding frenzy that lasted about a year, and then coming down from that, which is still here. So because of this, The late-stage companies found the world very flat, found there to be a lot of great crossover investors willing to look at great companies in the UK and in Europe and elsewhere. The early-stage companies really struggled to get funded, most importantly because this forced the GPs to make decisions without ever meeting founders face-to-face, which is a huge psychological barrier to many venture capitalists. And then on top of that, the LPs were first forced into a situation of backing funds where they have perhaps never met the founders or the operating team. So the lasting legacy of all of this, I think, is being able to get to a higher conviction and a higher level of comfort without seeing people face to face. Whether that's going to stay is a very interesting question. I guess we'll see in a couple of years.
So many thanks for those opening comments. There's obviously a supply chain or process going from discovery all the way through manufacturing, commercialization, and each one of those is going to be impacted by some of the learnings of COVID. But maybe to start with clinical trials, which is one area I think the UK can feel quite good about in terms of the number of interventions that we either validated or invalidated compared to some of our friends in the US, where the trials were typically smaller and they weren't really built to power the questions. Now, 4 of you had direct experience in clinical trial development. So could you talk to what are the learnings, particularly using adaptive type trial designs, which can we then lend and share onto other indications beyond COVID? And how is the regulator going to embrace that? And regulator is obviously a loose word because obviously there's US, there's European, there's UK, and so on. But just more broadly about how is clinical trial design, planning, execution going to change beyond COVID going forward for those who have direct involvement in the trial process, which I think is 4 of you. So whoever wants to kick off first.
Okay, I'll do it. So everybody's talked about the collaboration, and I talked about platforms, and I talked about the ability to have those platforms set up, ready to go, and get those adaptive trials rolling. Having an organisation like the MHRA work in the way that they worked, knowing that the eyes of the world were upon them, and just how competitive they had to be in their performance was absolutely fantastic. And I don't think they've left that at Wave 3 COVID door. So, the speed with which they work, some of the programs that they brought in, so the innovative license access pathway, probably about 20 drugs in that program already, and it was only launched in January. Project Orbis and collaborating with other countries, I think, again, really, really important. That's particularly important when we look at another area of our clinical research, which is in rare disease. So leaving the European Union wasn't really very helpful in terms of being able to do rare disease studies. So being able to have that external collaboration, really, really important. And I think that the other key learning has been the resurgence of vaccines. So, we now have mRNA vaccines in, nearly 1 billion people worldwide. When we think about how much time and effort goes into, forgive me, John, but, getting cell and gene therapies out there into a small cohort of patients, I think there's a great learning around that. And again, having those platforms, so the mRNA platform, the Cerner platforms, where we've already got 4 therapies in there, therapies such as inclisiran. These platforms enable people to go at pace, at scale, and with safety. And I think that, the comment about, when you have a crisis, just how much it focuses the mind on what needs to be done, absolutely key, Andrew. So,
Richard or John, would you like to add, or Sean? Sean, why don't we start with the elephant in the room?
Yeah, so I think for us, adaptive clinical trials, when we consider our COVID vaccine, is important if we see that there is growth of variants that may need a tweak to the vaccine. And I think the regulators are considering quite positively how we can quickly drive a product license variation on a variant. I think when you extend that beyond the COVID vaccine, one would hope that the regulators would continue to work quickly for life-saving medicines. I think if we get back into the norm again, we may not see things so quickly as before, but there's definitely a heightened sense of what is possible. And of course, when you've got some of these life-saving drugs like cancer products, which of course we're active in, that will make a difference. So I think that I do think that the COVID experience will allow us to become a little bit more flexible with the regulators, but time will tell, and we will see.
John?
Well, I mean, we've seen working with AZ just how quickly they got these drugs through trials, and we saw the collaboration between the MHRA and AZ with getting emergency approval to get this on the market, so getting patients treated. Now, the speed here was absolutely essential. We were obviously up against something which is still very active today, but the government strategy has been proven to be very successful in vaccinations across the country. And you can look at other countries in Europe that haven't done quite so well and the problems they're having now. I think the booster is very important now. So I had my booster on Friday, still feeling a bit rough from it, but I have to say. But it does the job. It protects you, and that's what it's meant to do. I've seen a lot of things happen quickly. My fear is the absolute urgency drove this to happen. Will it stay with us, and will it slow down afterwards? I mean, that's the problem, because there have been many other, this was a couple of drugs going through, 2 or 3, maybe 4, very quickly to get things moving. Will it happen when there are lots of things happening again and life goes back to normal? That's my worry, is we go back to where we were, but hopefully not.
And then just on the subject of once you have a validated drug, you obviously got to supply enough of it, and some of those points came out in the answers to your opening comment. But one of the remarkable things I think of our industry compared to other industries is, with relatively few exceptions, the supply chain never broke down, which I think talks to the preparedness that is inherent within the industry because of the need to have redundancy and so on. But perhaps you could talk to what learnings are there on the supply chain, or is it as good as it can already be? And have there been particular advances, particularly in the field of biologics, both in cell and gene therapy and vaccines, which we can avail ourselves with going forward?
Some of the learnings here were quite significant, and that we found a shortage of supplies because of the number needed. Bioreactor bags, filters, all these types of things. And lots of the manufacturers were just running out of supply all over the world. We saw stuff from Latin America, we saw stuff down in China, we've actually saw stuff that's been sent out by the big American companies. We also saw, and I don't like to say it, we also saw things being rationed from export from the US because they wanted to keep everything back there to make vaccines for the US. That was quite profound at one point in time. Appears to have abated significantly. But I'd say what has been very, very commendable is that the supplies of these raw materials have been building plants and getting plants moving in Europe and the other parts of the world very, very quickly. So if this ever happened again, there would be massive supply, I think, able to cope with what we need to do. So you've seen that reaction, but we have seen the demand for these things just go through the roof, and the problem that people had to get them into their factories was just quite profound.
If I might add to that, it's important to recognize that the supply chain never broke, luckily, for the vaccines and the COVID therapeutics, but very much broke down for the early stage. There has been a uniform 9 to 12 months delay for the majority of preclinical startups in cell and gene therapy in terms of procuring material. DNA and RNA strand synthesis, hugely overwhelmed. Manufacturing of vectors, hugely overwhelmed. No primates for any type of NHP tox, coupled with the FDA demand for increased NHP safety data. Many animal facilities around the world completely overwhelmed with COVID trials. So essentially what happened is COVID sucked out most of the capability and capacity into solving the crisis, very much damaging the early stage pipeline. And we have to recognize that this resilience came at a cost. And the cost will be reflected not only in the kind of the backlog of the NHS, but also in how quickly can the innovative treatments come to market. And so the learning from this, I guess, is also recognize that innovation in the supply chain is very important, and perhaps even more important, to the early stage guys, because the existing infrastructure will abandon them if there is another crisis, which is right from the population perspective.
So that's a good point. Government was mentioned a few times, and government is multi-tentacled, and it can be involved in everything from clinical trials, importation, but also regulators. So as we think about the broader role of governments and how that may have changed going forward, maybe start with the experience you expect to stick from a regulatory perspective as a function of COVID. Because Angela, you highlighted ILAP and Orbis and as a ways to expediting the availability of novel drugs and the approval process and even some of the development. How much do you think that that is going to truly impact? And, you know, we're a small island, right? We're 4% of global demand. But just when we think more broadly about how those learnings have impacted, and whoever would like to start, maybe Sean, your experience with regulators and what you think is going to be the lasting impact of having been through the pandemic period.
Yeah, so the regulators, of course, were looking at the data in Europe on a rolling basis. I think all regulators, including the MHRA, were extraordinarily flexible and quick. How that, as I was saying earlier, how that will transpire in the future, we need to wait and see, because depending on the level of emergency, we may or may not see continued flexibility and speed. By that I mean if we did ever need a tweak to the vaccine, I would expect to see that speed. For other programs, it may take a little bit longer, because these regulators have a finite resource and many programs to review. And despite the best will in the world, I would be surprised if we could, unfortunately, approve all of our products in the same way that we did the vaccines last year.
Anyone else would like to throw their arm of the ring in terms of the impact of regulators going forward?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think Brexit got the MHRA match fit for what it had to do in COVID. And that was actually be competitive and move at pace. And we saw that a marked difference between the EMA's performance during COVID and the MHRA's performance. And we, along with many others in government, with industry, in academia, worked together on a clinical research coalition last year. And that went into become Lord Bethel's dearly departed, clinical research and transformation programme for growth. And I think they have really, in the life sciences vision, gone a long way to making sure that we are ready. We in the UK, you said small island, you're quite right, we're only 4% of overall global share. How we are ready to continue to attract more investment in clinical trials, real-world studies, and launching new medicines into the UK. And indeed, we just completed a survey in the summer, we IQVIA, across global pharma headquarters and biotech, and it was a repeat of a survey we did in 2018. 2018, it was doom and gloom. The UK is going to hell on a handcart. Yeah, we're disinvesting, we're not launching, we're not doing clinical trials anymore because you're so slow to get them up. The positive voice which came out as a halo effect of our performance during COVID, but also life sciences policies that have been put in place, such as the vision, such as the NICE Standards and Methods Review, really have turned that on its head. And we, for example, the MHRA, for a third of the responders, over 200 of them, will now be a priority regulator. They were nowhere near that in 2018. So, I'm cautiously optimistic.
And so a lot of our conversation has been on the biopharmaceutical side of things. I'm conscious that we have on the panel John, who obviously comes from the device side of things. So it's one thing to, particularly for a patient at home taking a bottle of pills. It's quite another thing for a piece of dialysis kit. And you play in an interesting space in that it's a device that can be used both in hospitals and at home. So how did that change the mix of your business and the need to be agile in order to maintain and fulfill demand and see where the demand was shifting as a function of the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. In a way, I could almost riff off Dima's comment, which is, in a world of scarcity, which is our world, scarce healthcare resources, scarce funding, if we're going to flex to do one thing, that often means something else is not happening. And so the impact on our business initially was actually counterintuitive. So it would seem obvious that in the pandemic, it would make sense to have as many patients as possible treating themselves at home to avoid the need for patients to be concentrated in clinics and to expose themselves and each other to risk. But actually the opposite happened. So even though the NHS did put out guidance stating that if at all possible, patients should dialyze at home, in order to make that happen requires training and educating patients to do so. And that was one area where the NHS was critically short of resources because many of the healthcare professionals were redeployed into COVID wards, into the ICU. And so some of the first areas to get sacrificed for that were the training programs for dialysis. So what we saw actually was, as we were about to launch, our market literally disappeared. There were no home training nurses to help bring new patients onto our device. So we did a quick pivot into the ICU, where there was a massive insurge of about 1/3 of patients that were hospitalized with COVID also had acute kidney failure. And so there was a shortage of renal replacement therapy options, and we were able to fill that by bringing our device right into the ICU. And fortunately, a device that's easy enough for a patient to learn to operate is also one that a critical care nurse can quickly learn to operate and deploy in that setting. So we had to be agile to respond to a structural change, which also revealed very quickly a validation of another market opportunity for us. So again, life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Mm.
So I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question which probably none of you might have thought about, but one that we think about a lot as a function of the pandemic. So governments are increasingly indebted as a function of the economic impact, and yet innovation is likely going to be going up rather than down, partly as some of the learnings that we've got from here. So how do you solve that? And one avenue that is a potential solution is to have lower cost versions of existing blockbuster drugs, and we're all very familiar with generics. But there is another source, which is China. So for every one of the blockbuster drugs on the market today, there is a late-stage molecule in China showing broadly comparative efficacy. And we're on the cusp now of these drugs being taken into the US and very likely into Europe on the back of Chinese data at accelerated cost and price. So are we just eating our own pie? Is this a good thing because it's going to fund development? Do you think this is going to become a reality? Is there going to be economic forces to block this or political forces? I'm just curious as to your collective views, given you're all coming from different parts of the industry.
Well, I can fire an opening shot on that. I think it's a part of the natural life cycle. The biologics are getting commoditized. Same as small molecule development did. You can now run a completely virtual small molecule development company, and as you do that, 80 to 90% of your development and discovery operations will be in China, just because the providers are so powerful. And we're going very quickly in the same direction with MABs, and even things more sophisticated than MABs, BiTEs, ADCs, enzyme replacement therapy, and so on. So it's completely normal. And this is because this is now, people still talk about biologics as a very new thing, but biologics have been around for 35 years and have been very influential in the markets for the past 15. So we're not really eating our own pie, because our own pie is now the third generation. The mRNA and other RNA modalities, cell therapy, gene therapy, more sophisticated target therapeutics like PROTACs, and so on and so forth. So that's where the cutting edge is. Not to say that China is not playing there. They are, and very well so. Now, look at Legend, look at other things that are pretty powerful in cell therapy. But in general, I think that's just a natural part of the cycle. And will be beneficial for all. We'll bring the cost down for the patients. especially in the US, it will perhaps bring better options to the NHS as well. So by and large, I see this as a natural thing.
I think there's enough things in place to protect innovators with patents and some of the things which are spun off the biosimilars legislation around data exclusivity for novel approaches. So I agree with the life cycle. Hopefully there's enough pie to enjoy early on as innovators.
It just puts additional pressure because, what I'm referencing is not biosimilars, but fast follower innovative molecules, which are in the same category. So another BTK inhibitor, another PD-1. So basically you're putting a deflationary pressure by the manufacturer launching at maybe a 70 to 80% discount to the brand. So it accelerates the erosion, and therefore, in order to generate the same return, you have to run the flywheel faster by generating more drugs or opening up new markets. So it's something that we think about because we see it as an emergent dynamic, but it's a little bit tangential. But economic pressure in any shape or form is going to increase that. So,
Andrew, I know you said, sort of they're not the biosimilars, and you're quite right. But, there are lessons to be learned from the biosimilar experience. And we did, and we see through IQVIA data, that where we've had biosimilars in places, people are getting onto these, transformative drugs earlier in the pathway. So from a patient perspective, force for good. Going back to your supply chain question, we did see major problems, as we know, particularly in wave 1 of the pandemic, with, simple APIs needed for paracetamol and goodness only knows what else, coming from India, coming from China, not coming. So then creating dependency on a country that, can be a bit temperamental around supply chain might not be such a good idea. So we should be gearing up within the rest of the world our own manufacturing capability for these things.
And I think that's what governments are incentivizing to do through different policies. It's more through the innovation cycle, but I understand what you're saying. So just tying this all together, and this has been a fascinating chat of, a huge topic, because obviously it extends the whole gamut of discovery through to commercialization. We've spoken about all the learnings that have been captured, the importance of people, remote working, close relationship with regulators, and many, many more. How do we make it stick? Because it's very easy in any system for inertia to step in and you get dragged back to the world to how it was previously. What can the industry do to stop that happening? Or is it just going to be fighting each individual battle on a case-by-case basis? So where is the points that the industry has to attack? What are the key areas that they have to focus on? How do we make it stick? So whoever wants to take that.
Remote working, I think that's one that's changed forever. I really do. Remote working has probably changed forever now. I think what's happened is you'll see people working at home a great deal more than they ever did. So I don't know quite what we'll enforce yet, but we're very flexible, because what we saw was the job got done. People worked every day, people did the right things, we got deals done, and things happened that they should have done. We had a very low travel budget to the States as well, obviously, no one went, but then deals got done anyway. So you actually wonder about how many times you have to go to the States to get a deal done. Lots of questions come up from what we've just seen. But certainly we will not be in a place where we force people into the office 5 days a week, as we have done in the past. But of course, go back through the pandemic, we were running with about 700 people, and I'd say about 250 were on site every day in analytics and manufacturing, because they had to be. The guys who could work at home did, and we enforced that because that was what we had to do. But we'll never see full occupancy of the office again, I don't think. And it will affect as well how we think about office space going forward, because we don't need desks for everybody every day. Without question, there's going to be less demand for desks, so we'll have less than we did.
Mm.
Anyone else? Sean?
Yeah, I think what this has taught us, and what we will continue to see, is an acceleration in innovation. I mean, the working from home is most certainly one aspect of it, but what it most certainly has got people to look at is the whole plethora of how can you digitalize drug discovery and development further. And I think that is a trend that will very much continue post-COVID, because, I mean, certainly for us, that was something that we accelerated, and I can see that continuing to be drive being a significant driver forward as we embrace further algorithms to select things like antigens that you may put into a particular vaccine or therapeutic if you're using it as a therapeutic.
I think we are still in an exercise of super prioritization, and I think that's been necessary to handle this global event. I think to some degree things will have to go back to a normality for the sake of all the other therapeutic programs out there which have been parked. We've been hiring people who've been unable to manufacture oncology drugs and things like that, and we've welcomed them into our company because we are on the front of this wave. But there's a whole backlog of things which are not being addressed, which picking up the points which were made earlier on. So I hope we can keep hold of the best items like the working from home and remote working and this, for the next event. You were talking about being prepared for the next event. I'm sure that next time around the vaccine will come along after 8 months rather than 10 months and things like that. And that's been something which was quite well teed up by governments and large pharmacos and the vaccine manufacturers. That wasn't an accident that it was done in 10 months. That had been prepared for a long time out. So, and I think some of the things governments have done with things like the recovery trial to knock on the head some of the daft ideas which were being talked about last year, that was a good idea. So I think there have been some tremendous things, and the industry and the way governments have handled this, I think when we look back, people say that was very good, but it has come at a cost.
So I think that's probably a nice place to end today's session. So I'd like to thank all my panelists for a wide-ranging number of very useful insights. So thank you so much for sharing with them and us today, and thank you for the audience for joining us.
Hi, I'm Matthew Neal from Consilium Strategic Communications, and I'm pleased to introduce today's second panel, which is titled Funky Finance, Bold Visions or Bubbles in the Making. The panel is comprised today of some advisors, companies and investors who will know very well about these topics that have been in the past year. We'll be looking at themes including SPACs, NASDAQ listings and other trends in healthcare corporate finance. Today, the panel will be moderated by Nick Moore, Managing Director of Healthcare Investment Banking at Stifel. And on the panel, you've got Eduardo Brava, Partner at LSP, Doug Derfler, President and Chief Executive Officer of Maxite, Bill Enright, Chief Executive Officer of Vasitec, Alex Hammaker, Head of Corporate Finance from Oxford Science Enterprises, Rachel Mears, Partner at Jato Capital, and Lisa Williams, Head of Investor Relations, EMEA City Depository Receipts. Nick, over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that. Welcome, Matthew. Huge pleasure to be here with you all face to face this year, which is welcome. I guess I'm sort of quarantined over here in some kind of nod to social distancing regulations, but anyway, really great to see so many people. I think my job is incredibly easy, which is one of the beautiful things about having a very talented set of panelists lined up. I think maybe just really to kick things off, and Matthew obviously sort of gave a high-level introduction. I think it would be great just to go down panelists sort of one by one. I think let's try to keep these introductions very brief indeed. Really just sort of a snapshot of your current role, and we'll start from there. So maybe Eduardo, you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Consilium, for inviting me here. It's a bit intimidating now to have real people in front rather than the computer. But my name is Eduardo Brava. I'm a partner at LSP since January this year, and I went to LSP to help manage the first SPAC that was raised with a European sponsor. So I'm the one managing this funky business that we're going to be talking about.
Hi, I'm Bill Enright, CEO of Vasitec. We're a clinical stage immunotherapy and vaccine company. We've got a number of programs in proof of concept studies right now. and during the pandemic pivoted pretty quickly to invent and co-develop with the University of Oxford the AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine that we've now out-licensed to them.
Alex Hammaker, I'm part of the team at Oxford Science Enterprises. We're $1 billion investor in IP coming out of Oxford University, everything from life sciences to tech to deep tech.
Good afternoon, I'm Lisa Williams. I'm part of Citi's depository receipt team. My own speciality is investor relations, but as a wider team, we aim to help companies reach the US capital markets as effectively and efficiently as possible. I'm also wondering, being on this panel, if there's anyone in the room who is working on a treatment for imposter syndrome, do please let me know.
Fantastic. And then maybe, Rachel, we can go to you on Zoom.
It's lovely to join everyone, albeit still virtually. I'm Rachel Mears. I'm a partner with JTO Capital. We're a Paris-based investment fund that focuses on breakthrough innovation in biopharma with just over 500 million euros to invest. And our mission is to go faster for the patient and further with the entrepreneur. And really what that means is everything from technical proof of concept, early in development, all the way through market access. Thanks so much for including me.
Thanks, Rachel. Doug, over to you.
Well, thanks, Nick, and hello, everyone. I'm Doug Dorfler, founder of Maxite. We're a cell engineering company, and we've had a funkadelic journey. We formed the company 22 years ago. Angel investors, VCs, AIM listing, and then most recently NASDAQ. And I have had the pleasure of knowing Bill and Eduardo and Nick for a number of years and wish I was there in person with you all. So thank you for inviting me to speak today. Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Well, thank you very much for those introductions. Doug, I'd actually like to sort of go to you first on one point, if I may, because I think, you and I have known each other for several years. We've never actually met face to face, even before the pandemic. And yet this year we've worked together on two transactions. Obviously the PIPE back in February, which Stifel managed on a sole basis for you, and then we were one of three book runners in your NASDAQ IPO. So obviously, really sort of the interface between companies and investors has changed dramatically. Maybe you could just share some observations with us around those processes, which were conducted entirely virtually, and maybe also sort of draw some parallels with sort of previous IR efforts before the pandemic.
Well, that's a great question. We did our first crossover round in May of 2020. We did that virtually because that was just the beginning of the pandemic, and we brought in two investors, Sophie Nova Partners from Paris and Kasdan from New York City. And then we did with Stifel's leadership another crossover, about a $50 million crossover in February. And then we just concluded a $200 million NASDAQ offering. I never left my house or my office during that entire time. I think we were joking about 100 test the water meetings, all virtual. We did a roadshow in a matter of 3 or 4 days, again, all virtual. So everything, and again, I've not met Nick, I've not met in person most of my investors. And so it's been a really interesting journey, but it really required us to be much more succinct and thoughtful about getting the message across, because not only are we doing this, but the investors are seeing, literally sometimes 15, 20 companies a day. And I think we all have to be very respectful of each other's time and make sure that we're presenting something that's crisp, understandable, and simple. And that's what we've been endeavoring to do. We also, just to add a piece to this, we hired as our CFO, ex-sell side analyst who I met the first time in person about 2 weeks before we actually kicked off the IPO, and I've been working with her for close to a year. So it's a very unusual situation when you're, not only talking to investors and bankers in the group, but then again, your colleagues on your team in many cases hadn't met them in person as well. So it's been a very surreal journey.
That's great. And I'd love to play Bill in here because obviously, you know, again, you sort of sit between a number of different countries, right? With the company based here, you're based in the US. If I'm remembering correctly, I think you had just about got your crossover round underway before lockdown came in, and you'd started meeting some investors face to face, and then moved that process into the virtual world. How did you find that?
Yeah, I think a very similar experience to Doug, actually. So, you know, we did start meeting with investors pre-lockdown. I mean, I joined Vaxitech in August of 2019, so I had a few months under my belt before things kind of locked down and got tight. But then everything else was virtual. So, you know, most of the fundraising efforts that we did was particularly with the crossover round, and then with the public listing, the roadshow, everything was virtual. And I would say, you know, it's easier when you have a face-to-face interaction first. You get to develop a little bit of rapport. So I think those interactions were probably a little bit easier. But, you know, we managed through it. And like Doug, I mean, I brought my CFO on in the middle of the IPO process. I had met him for coffee once in the interview process, and everything else was done virtually. Similarly with my chief medical officer, I mean, we met for the first time in person while we were ringing the bell on NASDAQ.
Right. So it was not just sort of, you know, one hire. It was a number of hires as you built out the senior team, as well as actually going out and raising the money, and all of that was sort of transitioned into the virtual world.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, we ended up raising in total about $280 million this year, and that was all done virtually.
Yeah. Fantastic. I'd love to get a perspective from some of the investors on the panel. I mean, maybe Alex, you can sort of start, and I'd love to play Rachel in as well. You know, can you share some perspectives, I guess, from the other end of the funnel? You know, how things have worked for you in the virtual world. Does it mean you can meet more companies? You meet fewer companies, but spend more time with them? How do some of those dynamics unfold?
Yeah, it's a slightly different situation for us, of course, because we invest locally in the Oxford and the Oxfordshire area. But it's been, for us, I think a tricky 12 months in regards to that, because we very much rely on being in the labs and in the departments of the various professors and the postdocs to be able to meet them face to face and to build that relationship. So there has been a bit of a slowdown around that, and I think that's going to play through over the next couple of years. But on the other end of it, when we're seeking co-investors for our companies, it means that we can actually think much more broadly in terms of the people and where they are based and the parties that we can bring in as a result of that. So that has really eased up that end of the
So I guess the challenge for you, it's really been at that sort of early stage, identifying the science, the scientist, the IP, and actually that sort of first spark that actually creates the company. When you're not able to do that face to face, that becomes quite challenging.
That's right.
And do you think that is a theme that's felt sort of more broadly by some of those earlier stage investors, you know, maybe that have a less sort of specifically focused geographic remit? Do you think that potentially we're going to see, you know, a slowdown in company formation over the next few years, and it'll just take a bit of time for that to catch up?
I think there's been a real bandwidth issue in the industry over the last 12 to 18 months, and I think some of that is as a result of the issues we're discussing here, but I think also some of that is just a result of the fact there's now so much of a focus on life sciences and on healthcare. It's meant that the rate of development within the industry has gone absolutely through the roof. But the number of people who are investing in the space hasn't significantly changed. Right. It does require specialist knowledge, and it's made it a real competition for airtime.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with all of that. Rachel, maybe we can play you in. Can you just share some thoughts on investing during a pandemic?
Sure. I think I can share a couple of thoughts. I think first, just to share with the audience, JATO actually opened its first fund during the pandemic. And so to some extent, we share both the how do you start something in the middle of a pandemic, but also recognizing that we really truly are in an unprecedented time for the biopharma space in terms of deal flow and innovation. And therefore, the bandwidth aspects are ones where prioritization and adaptation are probably our two highest priorities, both in terms of triaging and understanding and prioritizing deal flow, but actually, I think also one of the critical aspects is picking the right teams to invest in, the ones that themselves have adapted and can show that creativity and resiliency. So I would say, you know, one of the best and worst aspects of the last 18 months for us has been it's unprecedented. We have a pandemic, we have unprecedented levels of private capital, but we also have the convergence with unprecedented levels of innovation. And so there's a lot to choose from, but there's a lot of work to be done in terms of adapting to the virtual environment. The one last thing I would add as a perspective is we have found it absolutely critical, both for the companies we're looking at, but for ourselves as well, that having a network as well as experts around the table that you can call, virtually, less in person, but really rely on to get quick analysis to push you forward into your deal flow and really help to accelerate companies, because it's both the amount of work, but the pace. I think that becomes very, very important in the dynamics that we see in the ecosystem.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I think let's change gear slightly and let's talk about SPACs. And I think that was one of the key topics we had in mind, certainly when we titled this this panel. You know, I think, you know, we'd love to really hear from you, Eduardo, because you've been there and you run a SPAC. So perhaps you can share some perspectives.
Yeah, I think that sharing some of the things that were said, beginning of the year was super easy. I mean, again, we raised the SPAC in record time. I mean, we did the whole process in 8 weeks. We did the test the waters. We had a super oversubscribed book. So it was, you know, I've been raising money from a company, you know, and going many times to the US begging for the money. And then suddenly in 4 weeks, I had 5 times my book. That was a little bit unexpected. But there was a lot of money around. What we've seen is that then the market changed significantly, and that changed as well for the companies, because it was great for us to raise the money, but you know, all the companies had access to a lot of capital. So you know, then companies were looking at SPACs as, I'm not sure that this is exactly what I want to do. There's this feeling among managers that, you know, the SPAC is a second best route to going public in the US. So there's been a lot of education that I think that we've done, talking to the companies and trying to explain. Again, I don't think that a SPAC is good for every company. I just think that it's a super good instrument to have so that companies can choose between, you know, staying private longer, which is, you know, also an alternative, going public the traditional route, which is doing a big crossover followed by an IPO in the US, or choosing a SPAC that, so to speak, has done the crossover for you, and then all you need to do is the pipe on top. So it's an extra instrument. I think that is a great instrument for companies to have, and I believe that is needed in Europe. I've been on a company that was trying to get quoted in the US, and I know how difficult it is to get through that you know, crossover plus IPO path. So it was a pity that we didn't have a SPAC at that time, and I think that is a great alternative for certain companies. And now what we need to do is find the right company and the SPAC and show that indeed this is a very valuable way of going out.
I mean, I guess sort of speaking as a life sciences banker, one of my frustrations for many years was you either did your crossover round followed by an IPO and kept it sort of pretty regular way, or, you know, if you couldn't do that, you stayed private for longer, and probably couldn't maybe not always raise quite as much capital as you wanted. And, you know, the whole reverse merger route was always a little problematic, right, in the US, because it got you a listing, but it didn't usually bring you a huge amount of cash, and it probably didn't bring you the investors either. So I think, sort of to my mind, taking the best bits from all of those processes and getting the investors and the cash in the vehicle at the same time was really sort of a game changer for the SPAC market. And I think it's much different to a reverse merger.
It is. You have no liabilities, you have no employees, and then if you have a good sponsor, I think that you will jump some of the hurdles that people are very afraid of, like, you know, redemptions, which have become a very hot topic now. So it's just, again, like when you want to do the IPO, you want to have the right investors on the crossover and then the right banks to help you. And I think that with a SPAC is basically the same. And it's a good instrument, and you know, we just need to prove that it works in Europe. I think that people in the US now, they see it as a really nice alternative, and again, it's an alternative, and I hope that in Europe we will see that in a few years as a very normal thing.
Yes, yeah. You touched on a couple of quite technical topics there. Maybe you can just elaborate on them for the audience. You sort of touched on the fact that the crossover round happens up front, right? Because there's the money in the SPAC, but then some of that money can get redeemed, and then you have to do another pipe on the back end. So the shareholder base can change pretty dramatically through the process, right?
Yeah, so again, sorry for some people if they know this very well, but basically a SPAC raises money from European and US investors, and you have a public company that has shareholders, and those shareholders have until the very last minute, the day you're going to announce a transaction, to ask for their money back. That's their prerogative, and that's their insurance, just in case you want to do a very bad transaction. So you never know how much money of the, in our case, 127 million that we have in a trust account will stay after the transaction. So that's the incentive of A, having very good investors in your SPAC, and B, having a good transaction and explaining it very well to your investors, so the highest percentage of those 127 million stay. But we've seen many, I would call it SPACs with sponsors that were not known, that go to 95 of redemption. So basically, the whole money that you think that you've raised disappears. And so disappears at the time.
Then it is a reverse merger.
Then it's sort of a mini pipe. So at the end, it's a mini IPO, which then raises a lot of questions, because you don't have enough money probably to do what you need to do. So then, you know, the market performance then becomes very bad. So choosing the right SPAC, as it is for us choosing the right company, for the companies choosing the right SPAC to de-SPAC with, is very important.
Yeah. So it's really sort of aligning the right company with the right SPAC, with the right team, with the right investors, and you know, you only have to get one of those badly wrong, and the whole thing can get a little bit tricky, right? Yeah, yeah. Bill, maybe I can play you in here, because obviously, you know, SPACs were getting a huge amount of attention as you sort of moved through your crossover process and into the IPO. Was it ever an option that you had considered?
Absolutely. I mean, we looked at all the options to getting public. I mean, with my previous company that I listed in May of 2017, we did it via reverse merger, and we actually reverse merged into a company that went public through a SPAC in the 90s. So, exactly. But, you know, as my chairman said, you know, reverse mergers are generally thought of two drunks trying to hold themselves up. And so that, you know, didn't really like that approach. But the SPAC, it was interesting. And we looked carefully at that as to whether it made sense for us to try and go down that route. And as you said, it was, I think, the second best option for us. You know, I think for us in where we were, the IPO was viewed as the best route to get to the public markets.
Right. I've heard some investors talk about a SPAC as the right solution for a company that's a good public company, but for whatever reason is not such a good IPO candidate. Does that sort of chime with your experiences, your way of thinking about it, or no?
No. No. I think that, you know, a SPAC is another way of getting there. Yep. Exactly the same as you can do a small crossover with a big IPO, or a super big IPO with a very small, super big crossover with a very small IPO. I mean, which one of the two is better? Well, it depends. It depends what A, you can do, and B, which investors do you have, and what's the appetite, and what's the window. I think that the advantage with a SPAC is that you do everything in one go, you negotiate only once, and you have certainty that the transaction is happening. You know, you do a crossover today, and you need to know how the market will be 3 months from now. And let's face it, there are examples of, you know, there are examples of but the SPACing. So I'm not saying that the SPAC, again, is the solution. I'm just saying that there's very good SPACing examples, and there's some good companies that have done very good crossover rounds and have not been successful in doing the IPO afterwards. So the crossover does not guarantee the IPO, or we've seen very good crossovers with IPOs that have happened, were small IPOs and at a very, very small step up from the crossover round. So, you know, the wonderful transaction doesn't happen every time. And you know, I just think that the SPAC, if done properly, if the company is the right company, but does not have, for example, US investors, but is ready to go to NASDAQ and has a good use of proceeds story, having a combined transaction of a de-SPACing with a big pipe is a very good alternative.
Right, perfect. Alex, have you looked at SPACs at all for any of your portfolio companies?
Yeah, it's definitely been a huge theme over the last 12 months or so. I think I would probably share the thoughts of Bill on this one. We've seen it as a second best option for any one of our companies. It's always important to have additional options in the mix because who knows what may happen to markets 3-6 months out. And we do believe that they play a role in certain instances, probably more in US markets than at least UK markets. But it isn't an option that any one of our companies has taken yet.
Okay, interesting. Lisa, I'd love to play you in, if I may. Maybe you can just give us some highlights in terms of what you've seen change over the pandemic in your part of the market, whether that's sort of access to investors or you know, just momentum of companies, particularly in the healthcare space here in the UK and Europe, that are public already looking to use that ADR structure to go into the US.
Sure, I'd be very happy to do that, but maybe I could just talk a little bit about SPACs as well, because what we are beginning to see is perhaps the other end of the SPAC life cycle in terms of de-SPACs. And we are beginning to see companies looking to list on NASDAQ as part of the de-SPAC process. We're working with one company who you may be familiar with, Polestar, who are makers of electric vehicles. They've just filed their F4, which which will actually de-SPAC into depository receipts. So I suppose the good thing is that even if you're using the SPAC route at one point, it doesn't necessarily close down other options. And indeed, and the ability to use the famous Jobs Act at the other end. So just because you're coming out of a SPAC doesn't mean that you can't use all the benefits of being an emerging growth company, both through the IPO process, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, you know, the ability to file 2 years of numbers rather than 3, and the no need to have auditor attestation for over internal control for financial reporting from good old Sarbanes-Oxley 404B, to be precise. So you don't close off that route just by having a SPAC earlier in the process. So, you know, the Jobs Act and all those benefits of emerging growth companies, including using a DR structure if you want to, are still there. In terms of the wider trends that we're seeing in companies listing in the US, probably the biggest change over the last couple of years has been the continuing trend towards what we call a single listed DR structure. Traditionally, a depository receipt was a wrapper around a home listing, whereas now many companies, including those that are coming through a de-SPAC, actually just list on NASDAQ. So, you don't necessarily have to have that in-between stage of having a home listing as well. And I guess the other thing which being an investor relations person, I obviously have to mention, because otherwise I have to put a pound in the IR swear box, is ESG and the continuing growth of interest in investors in all three of those aspects. And I suppose the one thing that has really changed, although perhaps in the last 10 days we've seen climate change back very much on the agenda, is the social aspect, the S of ESG, even for healthcare companies where you would think your very purpose would tick the S box, but in fact that's not always the case when it comes to investors.
Yeah, Fantastic. Right, we have got 10 minutes to go, so I think it's probably time to open up for some questions. If you are participating virtually, please type a question in and it should pop up on my iPad. If you're in the room, please raise a hand and we will get a microphone to you. But we would love to hear some questions from the audience. Thank you very much, sir.
Yes, thanks a lot. Paul Heim from Valo Therapeutics. Could you give me some indication of post-SPAC, post-IPO performance, comparing companies that have gone through the traditional process with SPAC in the US over the last, say, 12 months?
Well, I'll give a high-level observation, but then you should absolutely jump in, Eduardo. I mean, I think the key thing, whether you do a SPAC deal or an IPO, you have to get all the right parts of the process joined up. So you've got the right investors backing the right company and the right management team and the right structure. And ultimately in life sciences, so much boils down to data and the science, right? That even if you get all of that right and the data is not so good, the share price is clearly going to underperform to reflect that after the IPO. I think that there probably were a few situations, actually probably most of the notable SPACs that performed poorly were not actually in healthcare. I think there were a number of situations that were, quote unquote, mispriced. But I think fundamentally in life sciences, to me, it's still very much about fundamentals. But
there's not a huge difference in performance between SPACs and traditional IPOs performance. The number of this SPACing in the healthcare and in biotech is very small. So what you have is a relatively wider distribution of results. If you look at the whole IPO space, I think that the traditional IPOs do a little bit better overall, but it's not a big difference. And there's, I would say, at least 50% of these SPACs. Especially what there is a huge difference is you take the right sponsor and then the average goes up significantly. Your redemption goes down and your performance gets better. And again, it's like doing a good IPO or a bad IPO. If you end up doing a small de-SPACing with the wrong sponsor, it means that you're one of those companies that would have never gone out by yourself. So then, of course, the performance gets worse.
Does that answer your question? And any other questions? Thank you, sir.
Can we hear me? Hi. Yeah, Priyesh Khanna here from Yakrit Discovery. Quite interested in, obviously we've gone through quite an upside on the SPAC side in the US. I think that's calmed a bit because there's regulations coming in as well. What do you see the pipeline looking like in the US and in Europe in terms of SPACs?
In terms of people going out to raise more SPACs or SPACs that have raised money looking to execute a merger?
Both really, but are we seeing more SPACs emerging again, or is this now a downward trend in the US? Is it likely to be a pickup in Europe as we're hearing people wanting to do SPACs, or where are we going with SPACs?
Yeah, look, I think there's been a moderation in the US just in terms of the amount of capital that's being allocated to that space. If you got your timing right and you raised your SPAC earlier in the year, it was plain sailing pretty much, right? But now I think much harder.
Yeah, I mean, there's some other people that have tried to go after our model and have failed to raise the money. So I think that it is much more difficult to raise a SPAC today than it was 6 months ago. Both here and in the US, there's some changes in regulation that has made, again, raising the SPAC a little bit more difficult. But you see good sponsors raising further SPACs. So, I think that if you are the right sponsor and you have the right investors, you can still, on today's market, raise a SPAC that should be able to find a good target for a de-SPACing.
Perfect. I've got two questions online, actually, for our 2 online participants. Doug, the first question is for you, again, continuing on the SPAC theme. Obviously, you were public here on AIM before you did the NASDAQ IPO, but which is sort of an added complexity. But did you consider using a SPAC to consummate that second piece with the NASDAQ listing?
Yeah, so when we went public on AIM, SPACs really weren't, it was 2016. We did look at it, and it's in your question, Nick. It was very complex to think about just moving from AIM to NASDAQ. Adding the complexity of a SPAC would have been, I think our heads would have probably exploded. And something that we really had focused on, and I haven't heard much talk about it here, is the analysts. So, these businesses are complex and complicated, and ours is, in the cell therapy space, a lot of things are going on there, and we really focused on ensuring that we had, the support of, in our case, 5 analysts that would write on us, and that was a really important part of our process to make sure that we had, they say you marry the analyst and you date the banker, and then the equity capital market is the dude that sits on your couch, right? So we really wanted to focus in on making sure we had the right analysts on our story.
You set up your fund in the virtual world. What was the impetus for that? Did you consider waiting to raise the fund until you could get out and meet investors face to face?
Actually, no. I think, like most people, surviving in the virtual world was not a choice. It was a matter of necessity and adaptation. We had actually done a decent amount of the fundraising prior to the world shutting down. And I think if we were to have the choice now is a mix of both. I've been on a plane to Europe 3 times in the last 2 months. But not a 4th, obviously, for this meeting. And so I think we're all going to have to navigate what the new normal is there in terms of fundraising and relationship building. But, I think there was actually a prior session, the prior panel that said, just around the corner is something else to adapt to, right? Supply chain disruption, another pandemic, any sort of disruption. And I think most businesses that have succeeded, including ours, during the pandemic have done so with the right mindset, which is, there will be something next. And having preparation and adaptation as the 2 high values are probably useful.
Great observations, I think. We've got another 2 or 3 minutes, so maybe I can just ask each of our panelists for their final thought, either in terms of, what is next. Making big, bold predictions on public panels is always dangerous, but, if you feel inclined, share with us what you do you have any predictions for 2022? For example, what do you think has been one of the best learnings coming out of the last 18 months in the virtual world? What do you really want to hold on to there? In the theme of the conclusion of the previous panel, we should be careful not to slip back just to the old ways and lose all of those new learnings. But maybe Lisa, you'd like to kick us off.
Yeah, sure. My real prediction is that England will not win the World Cup in 2022. But I think definitely from an investor engagement perspective, it is going to be very interesting. People talk, as indeed the previous panel did, about the desire to see investors face to face, but at the same time to capitalise on the gains that we got from virtual. And I think many issuers and investors that I speak to are still trying to get their heads how they're going to make that work.
Fantastic. Alex, any thoughts?
I think there's another theme in funky finance that we haven't touched on this afternoon, which is the increasing presence of generalist investors in specialist healthcare deals. Then, of course, in crossover rounds, but I'm talking in the round or even 2 before the crossover round. The additional capital is, of course, welcome where it can be managed appropriately. But, of course, one of the first things that happens when you have that increasing competition for people trying to get into deals, it goes to valuation, it goes to pricing. I worry, I wonder about what that world is going to look like once that pressure comes off and you're left with a series of companies that have frankly got out over the front of their skis.
Yeah. Great observation. Bill?
Yeah, I guess maybe in continuing on with stuff that we didn't get to talk about is the importance of capital from around the world. We've got investors from South Korea, from China, from the US, from UK, from Europe, and I think that's one of the nice things about the virtual world is that makes that capital more accessible. I can tell you, having done IPO roadshows the old-fashioned way and this way, it was much more convenient to sit in your home office and hit 15 investors in a day than spend a week on a plane, running around like a chicken with your head cut off. So I think there are some things that as you said, getting that balance right, getting in front of people and meeting them. There's no replacing face-to-face and having a meal with somebody, breaking bread and that kind of stuff. There will have to be a balance. And my prediction on the football, the U.S. will make it to the quarterfinals at least.
Eduardo?
I'm going to make a bold prediction that there will be a big despacking of a European SPAC next year, and that there will be at least 2 European SPACs in 2022.
Okay, I've made a note. We'll check in again this time next year. Fantastic. And then Rachel, Doug, maybe I can just come to you. Rachel, do you want to just jump in first?
Sure. Actually, I'll build a little bit on Eduardo's point, maybe not so much from SPACs, but to just recognize the unprecedented level of private capital going into innovation in biopharma, and that what we're seeing is distribution of that beyond the traditional innovation centers. And I think that will drive a lot of what we talked about here in terms of alignment among investor sets, generalist versus specialist, new kinds of syndications, and quite frankly, the need for new options as companies and teams continue to extend around the world geographically. So I still think it's a very bold and interesting time with innovation and capital, but I think it's going to require a lot of executive teams to assess their options as they get closer to the public markets, and then perhaps most importantly, ensure they have a post-market performance that will bear out regardless of which route they choose.
Doug, is it going to be your third IPO on a third market in 2022?
I hope not. That's not a prediction I want to make. I think we all learned that these command and control organizations that we may have all grown up in just aren't going to be functional in the future. I think that we trust everyone to do their job, and they're doing their job. I think it's going to be a challenge, though, in the future, certainly in the IR side, because with social media, there's going to be more opportunity for people to talk about what their companies are doing, and more opportunities for investors to find out what companies are doing without going through the IR department or going to the CEO or the CFO. So I think it's going to be a challenge to try to make sure that, and I think it's a communication challenge and a leadership challenge. So we have to make sure that everyone in your organization has a clear sense of what your purpose is, and we develop those relationships with investors. So I think that may hopefully drive some of the needed changes in MiFID II, some of the ways that we are communicating with investors. I think maybe harkens back to a time that was not what it is today. And I think we all have to be looking from a legislative and a rules perspective to make sure that companies and investors, including journalists and retail investors, can gain access to information on a level playing field and not have to always go through a bank, for instance.
Perfect. Well, on that note, let's wrap up there. It really falls to me to thank my extremely talented panel for doing all the hard work. So thank you very much indeed for participating and supporting the event.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I think we can start, as people have mostly made their way back from the coffee break. And if not, then I think we can kick off without them. Thank you again for attending. I'm Matthew Cole. I'm a partner at Consilium. I have the great pleasure to introduce our third panel to you today, Healthcare, Winning Hearts and Minds. We've touched on this in the last couple of panels, but I think this is an opportunity really for us to focus on I guess what someone called the S in ESG, the real social purpose of our industry, and one that we should all be very proud of and remember on a day-to-day basis. I think the purpose of healthcare and in general, the performance within COVID of everyone within our industry to really rally the forces and really demonstrate the industry's ability to make a positive social impact, real positive impact on people's lives was absolutely tremendous and gave us a great opportunity to remind the world of our place as an industry. But yet the challenges remain, really, and the challenges with which we'll all be familiar, whether it's pricing, whether it's access to medicines. It's looking at the great scale of both direct and indirect financing and funding that we get from public bodies and what that means in terms of a social compact, and then kind of understanding perceptions about how people view us when we're talking about profitability or headline pricing for medicines. Likewise, we also look at things like privacy, but also then the importance and the engagement of health that everyone feels now, and everyone has really felt, I think, more now because of COVID. People have become more engaged in their health. They've had to do things remotely for themselves. And getting that interface between engagement but also the respect of people's privacy, I think that is and will continue to be very important in general for our ability to make an impact, but also our reputation within this industry. So without further ado, I will then hand over to the panel as I introduce them, and then I'll hand over to our moderator. But joining me on the screen is Clive Dix, CEO of C4X Discovery, a cutting-edge discovery engine, and recently Deputy Chairman of the UK Vaccines Task Force. To my right is Nicola Maguire, partner at law firm Cooley and one of our sponsors. Then to her right is George Goldsmith, CEO of mental health care company Compass Pathways. And then we have Emma Wheatley, Deputy General Counsel and Head of Business Development at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI. To her right is Lord Paul Drayson, a lifelong science entrepreneur and former CEO of Powderjet, now, as well as a former UK government minister and now CEO of Sensine Health, the ethical clinical AI company. And then to his right, we have Paige Bischoff, Senior Vice President of Global Public Affairs at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. And finally, Hannah Kutchler from the FT, Global Pharmaceuticals Correspondent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you for introducing our panel. There are rather a lot of you, so I'm glad I didn't have to read all that out. Before we get started, a message to our audience, both here and online. We'd love to hear your questions, particularly if you think that mine aren't provocative enough. Please do write in, and I will take them at the end. So, as Matthew laid out, there's an awful lot to cover, but I think that the question on everyone's mind at the start really is whether the industry's reputational bounce is based on a sort of true appreciation of scientific efforts and understanding gained during the pandemic, or is it sort of, I'm really grateful that you gave me the vaccine and I could get back out there? I'm going to ask Paul to start us off with that one.
I think there has been a fundamental the vaccine has been very much on everyone's mind. The effect of the pandemic and the way in which the life sciences industry in general responded has brought up to the attention of not just the general public, but also other businesses of the importance of the life sciences industry. One of the things that's been quite interesting for me, I'm a non-executive director on the board of Airbus. And so the impact of the pandemic on a huge company like that, employing 150,000 people around the world, really brought home to them how the differences in the way in which different countries around the world responded to the pandemic, the fact that there wasn't a global alignment in terms of the response, and the variation in that response, I think has completely changed their appreciation of the importance of health fundamentally. So that's an industry that has been most concerned about sustainability and climate change. It's now also thinking very seriously about health issues within society in a way that it probably wouldn't have done in the past. And I think this is a fundamental change which has a potentially huge impact for society and certainly for our industry.
Nicola, what do you think? Do you agree with Paul?
Yeah, I think it has made the sort of the general public realise how much the life sciences industry is a global industry, and that you can't just sort of look at individual companies. You have to look at it at the impact of the sector sort of worldwide. And I think that the whole, that one country can't just go out on their own. They have to sort of pull together with lots of other countries and work to solve the problem.
And Emma, obviously coming from CEPI, you have a very global view. Do you think that the industry has received the same kind of reputational bounce in countries where people aren't as vaccinated?
No, that is a very easy question to answer in one word. No, so one of my colleagues recently visited Africa, and the one question that they were greeted with everywhere was basically, where are our doses? So clearly different populations have had a very different experience to date of this pandemic. 70% of the doses that have been made available to low-income countries globally have come through the COVAX facility. And there is still a very low rate of vaccination in low and middle income countries. So clearly a very different experience.
So one of the big puzzles when we're talking about both how vaccines are distributed across the world and reputational bounce, at least from my point of view as a reporter, is why AstraZeneca hasn't really had this reputational bounce in the same way, despite being the main provider to the rest of the world and being non-for-profit, at least until Friday vaccine. Clive, I wonder why you think that's happened, if you could compare, say, AstraZeneca to Pfizer.
I think it's all, that whole issue is down to how the company communicated what was going on to the world. So I think Pfizer was already a vaccine business, a big vaccine business. It had vaccine communication experts, and therefore they spoke about vaccines in the way that you need to speak about vaccines. AstraZeneca is a pharmaceutical company that sells drugs, and it has the odd vaccine in its portfolio. It doesn't have that same size of an understanding that Pfizer does in terms of how you communicate around vaccines. And I think it slipped up. And then on top of that, there were then if you're the first vaccine and you don't quite make it on day one, everybody thinks there's something wrong. These people were every company working at breakneck speed. It just so happened that they had to put a lot of effort into making that first vaccine, the Oxford Group and AZ, and they didn't get there as quickly as they promised. And everybody pounced on them. And yet now they're producing more vaccine than any other company, and they are distributing it throughout the world. And people sort of had already got on the train and on the treadmill of telling the world, Pfizer's better than AZ, etc. And they had this terrible comparator going on. And I think they just didn't get out of that loop.
Paul, what do you think?
So I think Clive sums it up perfectly, and I think it really underlines the importance of communications to the general public. I think one of the things that this industry has learned over the decades as waves of different scientific innovations have come through, which have challenged the way in which society regards those innovations. So, for example, GM foods, MMR vaccines, stem cell research. In each time, we've learned in this country the vital importance of effective communication with the general public in an open and transparent way, which allows the general public to come to a view based upon good information about the pros and cons. And so I think that is something which the industry is still not doing enough of. So we've had this incredible experience over the last 18 months where the world has literally been changed. And the importance of the research and innovation that this industry delivers has been massively underlined. but we're still not really doing a good job in terms of policy engagement, in terms of explaining how the lack of alignment between different countries has really held back the effectiveness of some of the interventions that could have been made. And I think there's still a view in our industry that this is something that someone else needs to do, that politicians need to be doing it, or journalists need to be doing it, but it's not the people inside the industry that need to do it. And I think that is a change that needs to happen. If this isn't just going to be a short-term bounce and it's a sort of long-term fundamental change, I think that's going to be really important.
Paige, you obviously don't represent vaccine makers, but you do engage with politicians on behalf of the industry. Do you think that, maybe not you personally, but do you think that the industry is very good at that?
I think there's a really big difference between marketing and advocacy, and I think that the pharmaceutical industry has done a tremendous job in terms of marketing itself. That unfortunately sometimes leads to reputational issues around pricing in particular, and that's a global problem that we see. Advocacy is something that I think we don't do as much of effectively as we should, and I think that advocacy means we need to be in front of those policymakers on a regular basis, educating about what our therapies are and what they do, and most importantly, what they deliver to patients, and try to encourage the conversation to, I think, get off of price and really focus more on value. And I think that the vaccines underscored for the world the value that science and medicine can bring, and we need a lot more of that.
George, do you think that we always call it threat of pricing reform, but I think that's very loaded language. Do you think that the industry's changing reputation will change how politicians treat it when it comes to pricing?
Well, I think that one of the key issues, I'm thinking that we're in this moment that Voltaire said where trust arrives on foot but departs on horseback. And I think we're waiting to see if the horses are arriving. I think a lot of that's going to be based on the behavior. And I think part of the behavior is really a reckoning of, are we part of the healthcare system? Are we there linked arms with those who provide, those who purchase, or are we vendors to it? And I think if we actually are partners in that system, that will change the ground upon which we operate. If we continue to be vendors trying to extract the highest price independent of value, then I think the horses come.
Clive, what do you think? Do you think that the industry is sort of changing its approach?
I think it's too early to tell. I think we have to be a little bit careful of using the pandemic and saying, look what we did and this is what we should do. Because this was war. We had an enemy. Everybody together had a common enemy, which means people did work together and they learned that that was a good thing to do, and it actually produced great results. But once we get back to a norm, how much of that can we keep if there isn't that common enemy on our shoulder all the time? It's going to be very difficult. People then revert to their norms. Even now, you can see that we really haven't done a brilliant job as a globe. We haven't got vaccines to all the right places. The wealthy countries are going on to their second, third boost, fourth boost, talking about securing the vaccines for themselves, while some countries just haven't even had any vaccines yet. So, for me, what we did was incredible. It did bring everyone together. I'm still of the belief that was because it was war and everybody just did it. I'm still not sure how much of it will be kept. I think the reputation of the industry went up because we did it. But unless we start changing some behaviours and do things in a different way in the future, then most of it will be lost, I'm afraid. I'm not that optimistic that we'll be able to keep it, but we do have to push to keep it.
Do you think that anything will be kept from this war and the lessons learned? Obviously, you're thinking about future outbreaks as well.
I'm a bit worried about the lessons that will be learned from this war. I agree with Clive that people really pulled together to do the R&D aspect of this. At that point, though, once there was a marketable product, clearly countries were in one of the biggest prisoner's dilemmas you're ever going to see. And they had to face this question of, do I look after the electorate who elected me, or do I look after the world in a more equitable way? And that was really challenging. And you mentioned AstraZeneca earlier on. AstraZeneca, whatever the view on their comms strategy, AstraZeneca really picked this up and did the right thing, not just from the R&D side of things and the manufacturing side of things. They all pulled together. They partnered with people really effectively outside of the company to make a massive, massive leap, and they did it on a no profit, no loss basis. Nobody else did that. There are more doses of that vaccine out there globally than anything else. And yet, what will people remember? They will remember that AstraZeneca got kicked quite soundly, frankly, for doing that. And they will remember the lessons that we learned with Zika, perhaps, where people dived straight in, and they didn't want to dive straight in then for COVID because they thought it might be another Zika. So we saw a lot of the larger players hanging back from R&D early on in COVID, waiting for smaller players who were willing to take that risk to do it and then buy their way in later. So there are two big lessons there that have been learned from industry. And my question really is, how do we change that moving forward? Because people learn from experience and the actions that they observe and not the words that they hear. So to the advocacy point, really the question is, how do we then change that moving forward? And how do we get, as an industry, how do we work together in that advocacy stake to change that moving forward?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Does anyone want to take it? Anyone have any ideas how you get people to learn a lesson different than what seems to have been the most obvious one for some companies?
Well, I think there's some interesting work afoot in the area of mental health, for example, where the life sciences strategy has just been allocated funding to the Office of Life Sciences to mental health. And the question that's focused is, how do we actually take these lessons learned and look at bringing joined up activity from MHRA, NICE, and the NHS to look at how can we mobilize similar mindsets and bring it forth in new therapeutic areas, one that are, and certainly in mental health, perhaps even an echo of what we saw in COVID. And so I think that we have these opportunities. The question is how not to miss them.
I think we need to remember that the challenges that were faced before COVID are still there. So the way in which healthcare is increasingly unaffordable within Western society, and therefore the debate about, well, how much is the right amount in terms of public spending and what are the right models to enable the innovations that this industry provides can be affordable for society. I think that is a very important aspect of finding solutions to this. I think that I gave the example earlier that other industries have woken up to the massive negative economic impact that dropping the ball on health has. And I do think, therefore, we have got a willing audience at the moment to discuss this. I think the other thing we've got to recognise, I think the point that you made, that this industry positioning itself as working in real partnership with the providers of healthcare is really important, rather than them being the customers. Because, I mean, right now, there's the NHS in the UK is going through a really significant crisis. It's like February in November, and I was at a hospital on Thursday. The ambulances parked outside with people inside them, the pressure in ICU and so forth. And so therefore we've got to recognise that for the general public is aware there's a crisis going on in healthcare. And so if you talk to the general public and you make the points that, look, we've got to have a proper explanation of why And there are some solutions, but to make those solutions have an impact, we've got to change the way we do things. I think that's a role for our industry to be making that case in a way which we tend not to. As you say, it's too much marketing, not enough advocacy, and not enough being seen as, well, how can we provide a holistic solution which is affordable in the long term and sustainable? I mean, one of the things you could argue that what we've seen with climate change and just with COP26 recently is a result of the general public really becoming aware that things have to change. If there was a COP26 for healthcare, you could make the case. We need some kind of international realignment, learning from what's happened with COVID and the unfairness across the world in the response. And I think some pressure from society to actually come up with some new solutions would be a good thing, and maybe it's something like that is needed.
Is that a failure of the World Health Organization?
I wouldn't point out to any particular failures. I would say that there's a space for a new initiative.
Okay. WHO 2.0. Paige, building on what Paul said about the opportunities to work with healthcare and actually almost to appeal to the public, you obviously represent a sector which is very innovative but also very high priced a lot of the time. Have you found a way to do that?
We're working on it. So I think that what we're trying to do is really help folks get away from the whole concept of healthcare treating symptoms, because that's sick care. It's not healthcare. And what we really would like to see is the future, which is innovative, and it's these advanced therapies that can treat a patient, potentially cure them, but at least treat them durably for a longer period of time. So we have to wrap our minds around thinking about healthcare differently and getting away from fee-for-service and looking at what is the price tag we would place on being able to cure somebody or being able to ensure that they're healthy for the next 5 to 10 years, which they couldn't have been previously. So again, it's moving from what's the cost, and that being the almighty, and that's part of the reason that everyone's arguing and they all want the same piece of a limited pie. Whereas if we start to look at what is the value that we can deliver to patients, and how do we ensure that your geography does not limit the type of care that you ultimately could receive. So we have to change the way, I guess, that we've been thinking for decades and decades about sick care and making it more into healthcare.
I think there has been a lot of thinking about preventative care, but I'm not sure that the message has entirely got across beyond people going for their vaccines. Clive, can you think of examples where we've done a really good job of these two sectors working together?
Yes, I can. And actually, the experience I had working with the government as a member of the Vaccine Task Force and with industry and with all the other providers, what we saw in that phase, and again, it's because there was a common enemy, but we saw academic science, we saw small companies, large companies, and we saw the government, or I say the government being the Vaccine Task Force, because we were sort of a bit quango-y, basically working in partnership to get things to happen. So we didn't go there and say, let's procure your vaccine. We said, where are you with your vaccine? How can we help speed it up? Where are the blockages? Who can help you? Can we be part of that partnership? Can we take some of the risk? Can we even put some cash on the table to move things if that's necessary at this point, if that helps? And it was a real partnership. And what I've seen since, and my experience of the healthcare system, is in the UK, it's the NHS. And they sit there saying, tell us what you've got and see if we can, and then let's negotiate how cheap we can get it. That is not a way of working in the future. We've got to look at it holistically and work together in partnership for the solutions. And some of that means taking a risk on the side of the healthcare system, not just a risk left with the commercial side. And the commercial guys are always treated with suspicion by government, as though they're trying to rip the government off. Whereas, in fact, if they were working in true partnership, holding hands, they could actually provide services and medicines much better. And we saw that with the pandemic, and that's because we had to. Everybody had to do it. I just don't think we're there anywhere near that with all the other healthcare services.
I'm going to let you say, but before we go on, I want to remind people both here and at home or in the office or wherever you are online, that we would like your questions, because I'm going to go to questions in about 5 minutes. George.
About a decade ago, I had the privilege of co-leading an initiative with the European Medicines Agency, which was really focused on how do we reduce late-stage failures of reimbursement. And we had a blinding flash of the obvious. We need to talk earlier, more effectively, and not argue to the death at the end of poorly designed trials. And that, in fact, what should happen is that payers and regulators and industry should all sit around the same table and debate ahead of the hundreds of millions of pounds going into the deep, dark hole, and actually decide what would be reasonable evidence, and then to see how that worked with well-designed trials. That's been used almost 100 times now, reducing time to access, which is the critical bit. Regulatory approval is just seeing the starting line. And so I think that things like this, where we can come together and look at the problem together and see what bits we each have in responsibility, I think is a starting point. And I think that that's a lot of what happened in COVID without anybody designing it because of the war, because of the pressure. And now I think we have to step back and look at what are some of those lessons learned. But it's possible.
You bring up an important point about regulators, and Nicola, I wonder what you think will be the sort of wartime footing that will go away when it comes to regulatory cooperation, and what might we be able to learn from the example of vaccines?
Well, I think on the wartime footing, one of the really good things about COVID was the way that the regulatory authorities progressed things through the regulatory process really quickly, so that the pharma companies could get sort of emergency approvals. And I'd hope that that's something we can see continuing. And certainly, for other diseases like that they will be able to progress things quickly. But also maybe just generally that if they can act in a quicker and more efficient way, that will continue into other drugs as well. I think that's probably a more difficult ask, but I think if they've done it for COVID, then they can hopefully be looking over how they've managed to do that, and do that more efficiently for other drugs.
Yeah, that's certainly the pressure will be on. We started discussing this with me asking about whether people was really understood science and the sort of efforts that go into it. But of course, the other thing that we've seen during the pandemic is actually a huge polarization around science. We've seen, anti-vax movement gaining steam, a lot of criticism, in fact, abuse of scientific experts themselves. Do you think that we can learn any lessons for that, or have anyone got any ideas of how we actually bridge that gap between sort of the science lovers and the science haters at the moment?
I think a lot of that is education.
No. Nicola, you go first. I'll go Clive afterwards. He's just laughing because you put his hand up.
So I think a lot of that is education.
Yeah.
And I think that comes from education from the pharma companies, but also from through schools and educating the younger people, so that they can understand what the science is and then feel more comfortable about taking vaccines and the reason why you need that.
And Clive?
So I think we have to look, when this subject comes up, it's almost like there's 50-50 views. The people who are really anti-vaxxers are a real minority, and we shouldn't give them too much airspace. I think people who are anti-vaxxers should be listened to, and people should answer them sensibly with data. But it's the vaccine hesitancy group that are people who are worried about health, and they should be communicated to very well, because they're hesitant because they don't understand the pros and cons of all medicines, I think. It's not just vaccines. People are scared of things. But I really think we shouldn't keep talking about there's those people that are against versus those people that are pro. Given 90% of the UK ran to get their vaccine as soon as they were available, that's a massive statement of confidence in the healthcare, in that part of the healthcare system. It really is. It's not like we've got a huge problem with giving vaccines to people in this country.
No, maybe not in this country.
It's not the same elsewhere. In the rest of the world, there are places that probably haven't been educated, and they really do need a lot more communication. But the UK haven't got that issue.
I think there is a real problem here that we need to be concerned about, because the atomization of the media that has come through the proliferation of communication and the algorithms that drive social media means that these views get amplified and targeted at specific people who are undecided in a technologically massively scaling way, which wasn't the case 20 years ago. And so when we faced issue of anti-vaxxers, let's say, 20 years ago, we weren't up against that technology problem that now exists. The fact that bad news is more viral than good news means the algorithms are not your friend in communicating in a balanced and effective way the pros and cons of vaccination policy. I think Clive's absolutely right in terms of we've seen fantastically positive take-up, but we've really got to recognise that we've seen the politicisation of this issue. We have seen how different political parties have taken scientifically different views because they believe there are votes in it. Mm. And so that's something that we're going to have to deal with. And if we are going to get to this better place in terms of a solution to the challenges that we face in making healthcare, high-quality healthcare affordable, I think we as an industry have got to look at how tech collides, if you like, with life sciences. I think that brings up another issue, which is, given that vaccination is all about the creation of a community effect and herd immunity, you've got to convince the majority of a worldview. Mm. And the same is in the use of data within healthcare, which is an important driver of the revolution that's taking place in life sciences. Getting the general public to be willing and happy about their data being used in healthcare is another issue which is on the agenda of the to-be-fixed list.
Yes, there's quite a long one. We may be able to come back to that later, but I do want to make sure that we get some questions in. So I'm going to go to the question, the first of which I feel almost berated by. And you can tell that I've only been back in the UK for a few months because I forgot to ask a question about Brexit. So this is from Steve Bates, and I'm going to go to whoever puts their hand up first. Doesn't Brexit mean the UK is now on a permanent war footing? If we are no longer part of a large market, we have to rely on our partnership working.
Yeah, Steve's right.
Oh, well, that's
we all agree.
We have a problem because of Brexit.
I think we have a huge opportunity because of Brexit as well to actually forge some of these partnerships, because I think this is an amazing place, despite my accent, for access to data, access to care, understanding how care can be provided to a population where it's a right rather than a privilege. So I think there's lots of things going for us here if we can figure out how to harness them and look at that together.
It's not looking so good so far, is it? I think that's fundamentally the problem. It was probably the greatest act of self-harm this country's done for a long time. It happened though, and the way in which we now recognise the issues that it's created and come up with solutions whilst trying to rebuild bridges which have definitely been damaged. I mean, the level of our international relations has been very significantly damaged by Brexit. And it's very hard to see any of the promises that were offered by those arguing for Brexit actually coming true so far. Mm. And the arguments that were made that this country would be able to move to a nirvana of deregulation and sort of the Singapore on Thames advantages, well, it's just not happening. And unless we see some real benefits from the consequences of Brexit, then I think we're going to see a very fast and deep change in the attitude of the general public towards what's happened. Because the impact in terms of people's quality of life, ability to buy the things they want to buy and do the things they want to do, has definitely been negatively impacted. It's not been a positive effect on our industry. So, as you can see where I'm coming from on Brexit.
I can. All right, is there any questions from the audience in the room? Oh, there are quite a lot. Okay. Yeah, over here first, please. I think there's a mic coming just for the people online. Thanks.
I think it's very interesting that a couple of the panellists mentioned the difference between a national health service and a national illness service. My impression is that the focus on technology and the cost of technology is very much relevant in a national illness service, whereby there's some treatment for every ailment. But do you think maybe that is slightly missing the point, because investments in public health and avoiding in education and avoiding illness could have a much bigger impact on ability to keep the population healthy?
Good.
I know we're investing quite heavily because we think it's a false dichotomy to look at digital clinical care and medicine. And we have an interesting issue in the sense we have a medicine that's given once. And so it's a really interesting question of how do you do precision, prediction, and prevention all in that kind of model. And it's really, I think, forced us to think quite differently about how to work on mental health, because the really interesting question is, when do you stop caring for someone? When they're just miserable a few days a week, or, how does that work? And so I think it really raises some very interesting questions that we're certainly engaged with payers and various people in the health system here as well. So I think that that's an area that we could certainly look at, and I think it's a false dichotomy, trichotomy, however it looks, because this is the 21st century.
Okay, there's a couple more. Anyone? Further back, thanks.
Thank you. Simon Best, currently Cumulus Neuroscience, but previous chair of the BIA and chair of the Bioethics Committee in DC. So very interested in this panel. Emma, I wanted to ask you about the forward-looking aspects of CEPI, because your mission presumably wasn't meant to be particularly about this epidemic, but about future ones and what we can do to prepare for them. But I know you've ended up as one of the sponsors of COVAX, which is very welcome and very essential. But has this slowed down the Future Forward mission, and will it speed up as the epidemic eases? And can you leverage what we've learned to really boost your future mission?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question, and I spend a significant proportion of my time right now dealing with those questions at CEPI. So clearly we were launched at WEF in January 2017. By September 2017, I think we had a staff of about 35. And now we have a staff of about 150, edging up towards 180, I think. Pre-COVID, we were very much in a prepare for epidemic mode. We had selected priority pathogens, we had a portfolio to address those, and we were planning for what an emergency response would look like. We clearly were not hoping for a pandemic. We were thinking that emergency response would be, how do you stop an epidemic becoming bigger and uncontrollable? We had some plans which in January last year we immediately began to roll out, initially very much hoping that this was going to be a fire drill rather than the real thing, but it was a good opportunity to test it. Well, by the end of the month, I think we were thinking this isn't an opportunity to test it, this is the real thing. And the amount of work that has gone into CEPI and setting up COVAX has been phenomenal. Across the industry, clearly phenomenal. And we have learned a lot. We are going through a lessons learned piece here. Moving forward, we have 3 pillars to our strategy for the next 5 years. More preparation, both in terms of the priority pathogens we already had, looking ahead to a broadly protective coronavirus vaccine to try and leapfrog and get ahead of these variants. Transform, looking at platforms, looking at the enabling science work that we've been doing around this, and looking at some manufacturing innovations in particular, focused on taking the science and the innovation to the next level, so that if there is a next time, when there is a next time, we can respond even more rapidly. You may have heard us talk about our 100-day goal. We are going to try and shrink the 300-odd days to 100 days. And then the third piece, which is critical and has come up a lot on this panel, is the connect pillar. We clearly cannot do this on our own. Nobody can deal with something on this level on their own. And all of those early partnership conversations have been highlighted in this pandemic as absolutely critical. So we are looking at what needs to be, which are the partnerships that are truly essential to move this forward, and how do we work in partnership with the countries that are involved, with industry, with the other public health stakeholders, to make sure that roles are clear, that focus is clear, and that we have a more streamlined and perhaps more effective way to address something like this in future. Thank you for the question.
Well, I'm afraid that is the end of our time for questions, but I think the discussion has been really thought-provoking. I think that, we've spoken about how the pandemic put the industry on a war footing. It created all sorts of opportunities for collaboration, but it also showed up some lessons that we worry about companies learning for the future. Trust arriving on horseback, and we're not sure if it's quite arrived yet. And we've talked over a range of potential solutions. I don't think we've got quite there yet, but we have, I think Paul said that we needed a COP26 for healthcare, so that's a whole 2 weeks to discuss the issues. I'd love to thank all the panellists, and I'd like to introduce my colleague Clive Cookson, who will be interviewing Dame Kate Bingham.
To be able to introduce the next session, to introduce the fireside chat, and to welcome to the stage Clive Cookson and Dame Kate Bingham. Clive is the science editor of the Financial Times, and having been at the forefront of science and technology and medical journalism for, and I hope you won't mind me saying this, some time, Clive is extraordinary.
30 years.
Clive is extraordinarily well placed to put into context the impact on science and the pharmaceutical industry on the course of the pandemic and the implications for the future. Kate is a distinguished VC who's led investments which have resulted in the launch of drugs for inflammatory, autoimmune disease and cancer. She also played an active role in setting up the Dementia Discovery Fund. But particularly for the delegates here from the UK, is for her work as chair of the UK Vaccine Task Force that she is perhaps best known. Thanks to Kate and the Vaccine Task Force team as a whole, the UK was very quick to secure vaccines and the first Western country to begin its vaccination programme. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that in the coming 45 minutes, and so I now hand over to Clive and to Kate.
Thank you, Chris.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. And it's also 30 years for Kate, as a venture capitalist. I thought you were going to say that, so I will. The theme of the last panel, which Hannah conducted so ably, was winning hearts and minds during the pandemic. And certainly Kate has done an awful lot to win hearts and minds over to the importance of life sciences and the industry during the pandemic. So thank you for that. I've had a few conversations with Kate over the years on public stages, and I've enjoyed them all, and they've all been very interesting, so I'm sure this one will be up there with the top. Inevitably, we're going to talk a lot about the Vaccines Task Force and what's happened to the vaccination programme in the UK and worldwide since Kate stepped down. at the end of last year. But I also want to talk about lots more, about venture capital, the life sciences industry, some of the other areas in which she's made a difference, particularly dementia. And I noted today, as I was looking through the press releases, that the government's announced an extra 375 million for research into
neurodegeneration.
Yeah, neurodegeneration, dementia and related diseases. So that's great. And again, we'd like to leave 10 or 15 minutes for you to ask questions at the end.
And actually, if people want to interrupt, are they allowed to do that?
They do. That's one of the great advantages of, the only advantage I found in online conferences, in that if you're the moderator and the questions come through, and they're always better than the ones I was going to ask, I can just borrow. So if anyone has a really good question, Kate said you can interrupt, so you can. Let's start. Our Consilium friends have asked me to start with VTF and vaccines. So let me start with the beginning of your time chairing the Vaccines Task Force. What went through your head when you were asked to take that job on, and how long did you think about it before you said, yes, sir?
Oh, well, so it was a two-stage process. The first was an email from Patrick Vallance, who you will all know, to join his expert advisory group. And my reaction at that point was, why would I join a vaccine expert advisory group since I don't know anything about vaccines? And the answer was he wanted an insight into the smaller companies. And actually, if you look at the vaccines, all but J&J actually originated in small companies in terms of the actual underlying innovation. And arguably J&J came through Crucell in any case, so there was arguments. So I did that, and that actually seemed reasonable because I knew Patrick, and that seemed legit. And it wasn't very onerous, so it was 1 hour every other week on a panel of genuine experts. And at that first meeting, I asked the real experts what was the chances of any of these vaccines being successful, to which they said 15%. And Seppi, I think it was Richard Hatchett that gave that stat. 15% for any of those vaccine candidates that were in the clinic, and less than that if they weren't yet in the clinic. So that tells you it's no different really from drugs in terms of the likely failure rate. And so that, I was a nice arm's length, advisor to this government group for all of April. And then the slightly more scary email text, because everything in government is done by text for some reason. And then if you get elevated, you move to WhatsApp. But anyway, it was a text. A text from Matt Hancock. And you always get this text saying, can you speak? And it came through at exactly the time I was on a government, this advisory panel meeting. So I went back and said, no, actually, I'm on a government meeting right now. So he then called me afterwards. And I'm not massively smart, and it absolutely did not cross my mind. It was very clear to me, having said that on the expert panel, that having these group of people speaking for 1 hour every other week was absolutely inadequate to do anything at all. And Patrick obviously knew that, and Patrick had obviously gone to the PM and said, you need to formalise this and make it more permanent, because nothing's going to happen otherwise. So anyway, Matt texted me, so I speak to him after the meeting, and he said, we want to have a dedicated vaccine task force, we need you to lead it. To which I have exactly the same reaction, sort of saying, well, why me? It's not, I don't know anything about vaccines. And I gave him all this long list of reasons why I couldn't do it. And then eventually he says to me, Kate, none of us know what we're doing, which I thought was actually also true. In a pandemic where actually no one's actually been through it before, you don't. So I then said I needed time to think about it. And so I waited till the following day and then went back with a list of conditions. And the conditions, because this is the juicy bit, is, and I think did I send them to you? Probably, was that it was a personal Prime Minister mandate, because actually if you got clogged into the system lower down, it might not work. And as part of that, there had to be a streamlined decision-making, because, again, I haven't had much to do with government, but what I have seen is it's not quick in terms of getting decisions made. I needed to have authority to hire, our own team. And then there will have been a whole lot of sort of other things, but those were the main things. And they came back and said yes. And so then I thought, well, I better actually get to London and just go and find out what's going on. So I jump on the train, and at this point, I'm then deluged with civil servants and permanent secretaries and everybody, from everyone, from defence, health, business. I mean, it was sort of all over. And I then get another text, this time from the Prime Minister. Can you speak? And again, I was on the phone to one of the government lot, so I said no, but, you know, in a minute. It didn't occur to me to hang up and speak to the Prime Minister. And he then said, you know, fantastic, you know, it's brilliant, you know, it's fantastic, you're going to, you know, get us all vaccines with the British flag on it. And I said, well, I don't really care where the vaccine comes from. If it has a British flag, fine, but actually we need to get the best vaccines. And I spent most of that conversation explaining how unlikely it was to succeed. Because that, if there's anything I've learned in my 30 years, is almost everything fails. And if it doesn't fail, it's certainly not gone the path you've expected it to go. And the likelihood that we would have to put up cash, which we would lose, was going to be very high. And that was the main thing I wanted him to take away from the conversation. Not that we shouldn't do it, because clearly at that point it seemed the only solution and the only way out of the pandemic was to find vaccines. But I was very, very anxious that they really understood what a uphill struggle it was. And I knew Patrick would have said the same thing, but I wanted to reinforce that. And whether he got it or not, he absolutely got the point that we needed to invest early if we wanted to have access to vaccines. Because if you invest and wait to buy them when the vaccines have been proven, you've got another year plus to wait to actually get the vaccines. So that was the bit that did work. And I would say it was a pretty courageous thing to do, actually. I mean, Paul, you've been in government, you will know, but for a PM we didn't have any spending decisions. So the spending was all made by basically the Cabinet Secretaries of Health, Cabinet Office, Business and Treasury. But to hand over that responsibility to non-government types is quite a big deal, I think.
Was it easy to step back from SV Health? Did your colleagues say, off you go, we'll see you in 9 months?
They did quite, actually. I mean, I had to go to the investors first because, again, all of you guys in venture will know that you have key person clauses. And key person means you have to devote your time to the fund. And manifestly, I would not be doing that. But the investors were all very good and said, look, if it gets us out of the pandemic more quickly, yes, you should go ahead and do it. My colleagues were brilliant and basically just said, don't worry about it. I mean, I didn't stop my board seats. I mean, the key things I kept going. But all the sort of, anything that wasn't completely critical, I stopped.
What was it about this background that made your time such a success running the VTF? What did you bring from the VC industry, which you applied? What was the most, there are lots, but what were the most important ingredients?
I mean, I think the single most important thing is acquiring unproven vaccines is not wildly different from making investments in unproven drugs and new companies. And so being able to pull together a team that actually brought that expertise that I lacked was critical. So Clive was immediate and fantastic. And of course, Clive and I know each other incredibly well. And he led the entire evaluation and prioritization of all the vaccines, actually much more beyond, but that's was the key judgment. And then obviously a team below Clive supporting that. So that was completely critical, and government just wouldn't have done that because and between us, we knew everybody in the sector. We didn't know the Chinese and we didn't know the Russians, but we were one step away from everybody otherwise. They were either in our phone or they were pretty close. So having the team to be able to connect with the industry and evaluate quickly what the different options were, because this wasn't a matter of finding the best ever vaccine, it was a matter of finding which vaccines could be effective and safe, but importantly could get delivered to the UK quickly. And because we don't have bulk manufacturing in the UK, so although you got John in the background, there was no track record of actually building these vaccines at scale. And so that our expectation was, yes, we could help support and build up the manufacturing capacity in the UK, but by and large, we're going to have to rely heavily on imports. And so part of the diligence was all about how quickly did we think these different companies could scale up. We made a judgment between Moderna and Pfizer. A lot of the data was quite equivalent, but we were not convinced that Moderna would have delivered to the UK anytime soon, and that's proven to be the case. So I think the single most important things was having the team to deal with incomplete data. And it was not, none of the vaccines were measured with the same assays, so they were not particularly comparable. And we talk about neutralizing antibody response as if it's a sort of a standard, robust industrialized assay, and that's not the case. And then there was lots of comparisons, if you remember, a year ago to convalescent plasma, and again, completely different. I mean, these were not clear benchmarks. So without the team, with an experience with this sort of building little companies dealing with incomplete data, that I think was critical. And the industry was critical. So I don't know if we've got John, but I don't know who else in the audience was involved. But with the BIA work, the bioprocessing group at the BIA starting to work with Oxford in February last year. It was February the 15th, actually, when the first connection was made. That is astonishing. So this was months before the vaccine task force was even conceived of. And so by getting the industry working with Oxford at an early stage, because they knew they were going to be the ones that had to scale up the vaccine production and develop the assays and all the stuff that goes along with it, again, we wouldn't have been successful had that collaboration not started early. And even though it started in February, contracts were not put in place for probably 4 or 5 months. So these were companies and people that were stepping up saying, we can help, we can do something, and let the paperwork and compensation follow behind it. But that was phenomenal. And again, I don't think there are other countries where we've seen that level of altruism work. So, I mean, my role was basically to shake the trees really hard and to threaten everybody to WhatsApp Boris if I didn't get what I wanted. And that worked quite well. But the real thing was getting the team in and pushing it quickly. So within 6 weeks, we had already basically put together the core portfolio. And then, so that was sort of by mid-June. And then by mid-July, we announced the first set of vaccine terms. So if you think about it, crudely, there are big companies and little companies. Big companies, by and large, we just placed purchase orders and we agreed an amount up front that we would pay for the manufacturing scale-up and development, and then the rest was paid on delivery. The small companies, we actually had to do a bit more because they needed help with the manufacturing, help with the clinical development, and so we put money up front for them in lieu of future vaccine purchases. And again, all the upfront money could have been lost. But that was all done by middle of August. We had all the vaccine term sheets signed, and then you had to turn them into contracts, and then you actually had to just deliver it. So the real hard work was probably the first 3-4 months.
Now, you said you had to let the Prime Minister know that these wouldn't be vaccines with the British flag on. And you've also said that you knew from the beginning that imports would be critical here. But looking back from now, what has happened, are you disappointed by the extent to which this country's vaccination is almost entirely dependent on imported mRNA vaccines? And also,
yeah.
Yes, sorry, go on.
Yes, I am disappointed. So, I mean, it gets into massive weeds, but the basis for vaccination seemed to be based on a COV boost study. I've not seen the data. And that was basically looking at if you gave a third dose to people who'd been vaccinated either with AZ or with Pfizer, what did it do? Now, I don't think the design of the trial was ideal. And because it's a very reactogenic vaccine, Pfizer performed better than AZ in that. And so that was apparently the government's decision for why they were using the Pfizer vaccine entirely to do the boosts. I don't know if that's true. What also is the case is they'd bought a lot of Pfizer vaccine. and there's inevitably a shelf life on it. So do I think that we should have a broader range of vaccines to use for boosts? I personally think we should. Now, we don't have Valneva or Novavax approved yet. Janssen is approved, but Janssen, not unreasonably given Paul Stoffels' complete commitment to global health, they said they did not want us to be using their vaccine for boosts when large parts of the world hadn't got any vaccine at all. And I think that's entirely reasonable. So in terms of the scope of vaccines that the UK had access to, there was a small number of Moderna. We had a lot of AZ and Pfizer. Novavax and Valneva not yet approved. So in fact, I don't think there's a lot of scope for them to do much other than to have used AZ more for the revaccinations. And the data that has come out suggests that adeno followed by mRNA is probably the most effective boosting strategy. But I feel disappointed that we haven't been able to support more effectively those smaller companies, so Valneva and Novavax. And both of them, I think, are great vaccines. And I think ultimately when they get approved, they will become probably one of the key workhorses. I think one of the issues with mRNA is it's super quick to design and to design into a vaccine, but with the cold chain and the cost to deploy those vaccines, it's about the same. So we spent a shade over £10 a dose to buy the vaccines. The mRNA was more like 20 something. And so our overall cost in my time was a shade under £4 billion for all the vaccines we bought, and the cost for DHSC cost to deploy was £4 billion. So that's an expensive thing for countries to have to pay, and especially if you look at low and middle income countries. A 2-dose cold chain vaccine, it's just, to me, with potential side effect issues. So, that you're seeing more and more in the news about cardiotox with Moderna and some of the potential issues there. So what I would like to see is these sort of well-proven workhorse vaccines, which are the protein-based vaccines and the whole inactivated vaccines, being used for kids and boosters as well as around the world, because they're much simpler and they won't be as quick. So I think you use mRNA as your first defence, and then you come through with these other ones. If I had a magic wand, that's what I'd do.
Yes, did you have a...
Yeah, shout.
Shout, and we can repeat.
Okay, so 2 questions for you. One, whether you've had a booster or not, what would be your choice if you had a choice? Number 1. Number 2, if you look back, is there anything you would have done different?
So on the booster, I didn't have a choice. I was on the Novavax trial, which meant I wasn't able to travel to any country that requires you to have a vaccine passport. So I got a bit frustrated and 1 week texted JVT and said, I'm going to withdraw from the trial unless we can get this sorted. And by the Friday, they announced that all trialists would then be eligible for 2 more doses of a registered vaccine. So I've actually had 4 doses now, all of which were effective. I mean, that's why it's a complete waste of vaccine. So I had the Pfizer because that's all that's available, actually. I do think the AZ is a good vaccine. I think they're both reactogenic, so they both knock you out a bit. But I think having that broad adeno immune response is good because, we evolved to get rid of viruses, so that I think the T-cell response will turn out to be an important part of the immune response. So I haven't had that, but I didn't have a choice. And what would I do differently? 2 different questions. I mean, sort of the operations of what I would do differently. Would we have selected different vaccines or anything like that? No. I mean, I think the calls we made Clive made, were the right ones. And I think the way we went about it. I mean, the team, so I just talked about the industry team, which was great, but actually the government team we had working at the senior level was phenomenal. So I'll give you one story. We had to interface with the Department of Health teams and the NHS teams to then deploy the vaccines. And the lady who was our key project manager, Ruth, who used to build submarines and run factories and everything, they were so organised in terms of thinking about every single contingency that on the first shipment of vaccines, so it was described as being sort of liquid gold in the back of these refrigerated vans. They had to get help from the Belgian authorities to actually get through the tunnels because there were roadblocks and all sorts of issues. Anyway, they get onto UK soil, and the van driver is driving down the M4, has a crash. So part of the contingency is already planned. M4 is immediately closed, and driving behind that van was an empty refrigerated van, ready to take the vaccine into to go to wherever it was, because every single contingency had been planned for. So the actual efficiency of the sort of the government machine supported by military was great. So and you know, from a project management perspective, I think it was phenomenal. So there are lots and lots of things that worked incredibly well. The things that didn't work so well was, and it got more guddled up, is as the process went on, because while everyone was in a bit of a panic and saying, get us vaccines now, we're willing to pay. And we weren't paying ridiculous amounts, but there was a real urgency to get things going. We were able to have these quick investment committees and get quick decisions, and things moving on. And as soon as there was a sense of, well, we've got everything covered, I think all the work that we put in place to start thinking about the long-term legacy has slowed up. So if I went back and did it again, I'm not entirely sure what I'd do, but I would just try and ensure that some of that long-term, and it really is about the flexible manufacturing, is to have that capacity more bedded down. Because at the moment, outside, we've got Oxford, and you can tell me how many thousand litres you've got, but it's a lot compared with where we were. And then we bought a veterinary plant, which has probably got another 2,000 litre bioreactors, maybe a bit more. Valneva, the government's just cancelled the contract. That had a whole bunch of, that had capacity. But we're still pretty small in terms of our available capacity to manufacture a new vaccine in the future. And that's the bit that I'm most sorry about, that we haven't really got it nailed yet.
Are you confident that the VMIC, which I think you alluded to as the Oxford plant?
No, I don't. I'm pointing to John Dawson at the back, which is Oxford Biomedica.
Okay, well, there's VMIC, and then there's the veterinary plant, which you mentioned. Are you confident about the latter two, from what you know, actually going ahead with their original purpose?
So the veterinary plant, yes. So that's now being managed by the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. And that, I think, is working fine. It's not making any vaccine, but it's got the ability to make vaccine should we need it. VMIC is still not finished. So I think I think the jury's out as to what's going to happen there.
Okay, we'll leave it there and await. Do you feel sorry for AstraZeneca at all? Do you feel, I mean, what's the... in Hannah's session, we were talking about whether it was a comms failure, and certainly there was some opinion on her panel that it was a comms failure, that they didn't communicate as a business well enough. What do you think, looking back and looking forward, what should they do now?
I mean, the stats, you will know the stats. The stats are that they've made 1.8 billion doses of vaccines, and that they are...
2 billion now. They had a press release
Okay,
today,
so that...
yes.
Oh, today, okay, you're on it. Of course. I mean, that is a phenomenal number. They're right up there with China in terms of manufacturing the most vaccine of anywhere in the world. And this is from a company that doesn't make vaccines. So it is phenomenal, and it's more than half of the COVAX vaccine supplies, and they're in whatever the press release says today, but my data was 170 countries. So I think they've done a really, really good job. And yes, I think there's been a bit of a comms failure. I mean, it's in part what happens when people are working round the clock and working at 100 miles an hour. And it's quite a small team. I mean, they've got a day job because they've got other drugs to develop and manufacture and make and get through. And there were different comms issues. One was the first press release they announced where they highlighted the difference in dosing, and certainly the implication was that the dosing was the reason why there was a difference, as opposed to flagging what everybody thought was the reason, which was the difference in duration between doses. And then the second big comms failure, I think, was their relationship in the US with their DSMB, where they again issued a press release in the States, and then the DSMB came back and said, oi, we don't think that data is right. Now, that is unfortunate. I wasn't in the room. I don't know why that happened. I do know it was the AZ was treated pretty politically in the States, so that they were treated as a non-US company and treated clearly differently from US companies. And you just the straight comparison between AZ and Janssen, they each have SUSARs, so the serious unexpected adverse event, and J&J was put on hold for a week, and AZ was put on hold for 7 or 8 weeks. So they definitely faced a reasonable amount of hostility, and I think it probably just alters a little bit how you behave, actually. But I mean, I take my hats off to them to go out to do this when you're not a vaccine company, to work with academics. So remember, this is an academic trial. It's not an industry trial. And so the lot of the issues which have been put down to comms is actually just because the trial design was different. So in the US, Monsef, my counterpart, who knows a lot more than I do, they basically said all US trials have to follow exactly the same protocol. And in the UK, we don't have a big enough population, and we didn't have enough infection to be able to run a single trial in the UK. So you have to run trials in other countries as well, and that also gives the ethnic diversity, which is helpful. So Oxford worked primarily with Brazil and a bit with South Africa and Kenya. And of course, the different regulators had different conditions. So you end up with slightly different data sets because each of the different regulators, they wanted a different, patient inclusion or different control or whatever it might be. And so that automatically means you're going to get a slightly more messy data set. And then, because it's an academic trial, it was there to ask a sort of academic question, does this work? And then if you look on clinicaltrials.gov, you will see there's a lot of arms of different patient groups testing different approaches, which is unlike a industrial clinical trial, which is a single arm with a very clear set of questions. So I think part of it is of the sort of potential comms issue or the noise was the fact that you've got a big pharma company that's stepping in to support an academic clinical trial, which it had not designed itself. You've got all the issues of the assays that have been developed in the academic lab didn't translate into industrial assays, so that ended up with this confusion about dose. In fact, it was a very useful scientific experiment, but not something you want to have in a pivotal clinical trial. And then they're able to scale up quicker and to a degree greater than any other pharmaceutical company in the world. I mean, it's an astonishing set of outcomes. And that's why I'm just baffled as to why both but the government and anyone involved doesn't just keep banging on their drum, and they've been doing it at a non-profit basis. Now, they have announced that they're going to start at least trying to get a modest margin in for, I guess, high-income countries. But that's not going to be a lot of doses, because by and large, the high-income countries have moved away from the vaccine.
Are you willing to give an assessment of Pfizer's performance?
Well, Pfizer was different. Pfizer took no warp speed money. So they took no government money. And they said, we're going to take our bets. We're highly confident in the vaccines, and we're going to invest in it, and we're going to charge market prices. I think it's just a different strategy. And also, it's not likely that their vaccine is going to be widely used in low and middle income countries. Or low middle income countries, given the cold chain. So actually, I mean, I think it was a ballsy thing to do. Again, I think the jury will be out as to what can they do to improve the stability of those vaccines to actually get them into a broader set of countries.
Yes. Before we move onto other areas, let me just ask you what, if anything, you've learned from your interactions with government in the VTF that you've taken back for your SV Health job? Has it sort of improved or changed the way you work at all now?
Yes.
Business.
Yes, it has. So I mean, everybody in this room will be involved in clinical trials in some way. So my first lesson was actually, what is it like to be a trialist? Because I'd never done it. We run all these trials, but it was really, really interesting to be a trialist. Now, of course, my first 2 visits were accompanied with cameras and, all the, press la-di-da. So it wasn't as if it was an anonymous visit. So that was, I was obviously given sort of gold-plated treatment. But then my other visits were absolutely under the radar. I wasn't seen by top consultants, and I didn't have all the cameras in tow. So that was really interesting, and I enjoyed that. The extension of that was seeing, so if you remember last summer with the lockdown and everybody stayed at home and the viral transmission went down massively. So great for the country, but very bad for clinical trials. And then, of course, in the autumn, when everyone went back to school and uni, then we saw a massive spike. So although we'd not persuaded Pfizer to run their study in the UK, which was a correct decision by Pfizer because we hadn't got the infection, we then started getting a lot more willingness to run clinical trials in the UK once our infection rates started going up. And so if I just take Novavax as an example, that was going to be a 10,000 patient or volunteer clinical study. And the recruitment went so rapidly. And if you remember, we set up this NHS registry, which has been very, very successful, which meant anybody who'd signed up would be contacted about clinical trials. What Novavax came back within about a week to say, you know what, this recruitment has gone so rapidly, we'd like to expand the size of the trial by 50%. Now that made it the biggest vaccine trial that the UK had ever run in this country. And we were still able to recruit that study in 6 weeks. So what I've taken out from this is actually if you get the stars aligned, you can run very, very quick, nimble, effective clinical trials in the UK. And if you look at the data that's been published in New England Journal on the UK Novavax trial, and then you compare it to the US trial that we were started and finished before the US even started theirs. Data's identical. Now, of course, they will have had a slightly different variant strains in the States where they wrote theirs, when they ran their study. But the fact we could get in and out and do that recruitment with really good data, that is the single biggest lesson I've learned. So the company that we've set up, now I'm back in my day job, is a back-of-the-eye ophthalmic company where even though the entrepreneur and the asset comes from the States, or the first asset comes from the States, we're actually setting it up here so that we can actually take advantage of that clinical nimbleness that we've got here and willingness of the different clinical trial groups around the UK. And I think that is one of the big lessons from me is, we're never going to compete with the US on depth of science and ambition of all our CEOs and all of that, but we can compete on how do we get really good, classy, effective, useful real-world data. And what we've seen in vaccines is the real-world data basically replicates what we've seen in the clinical trials, which is, again, astonishing. So it shows, again, that the trials have been run well to get the sort of answers that we need to get ultimately for therapeutics.
How can you achieve that nimbleness in other areas where there isn't such a sense of urgency as there was in COVID? For example, back-of-the-eye ophthalmic treatments. How can you get them running at that fast pace?
So there's 2 angles. One is the MHRA, and the second is how do you get them into trials. So MHRA, I think, has changed the game of how we work. And any of you who've seen June speak or heard about the different processes that the MHRA is putting in place to actually stop being a sort of an arm's length, giver of advice to being much more of a collaborator. How can we actually help you get your drug or your vaccine to succeed? I think that's, again, going to be a real game changer for the UK. So I think we're going to reduce the red tape and hopefully that will speed things up. And then the second thing is to go and talk directly to the different clinical trial investigators and spell out exactly what we need to do and get it through. I just think I've always been a much more concerned about, you can't go to the regulator until you've got everything completely sorted, which I don't think is the way they want us to interact with them now, which is good. And I think that investigators who've been running the trials, over 10% of COVID patients were enrolled in the recovery study. That's a massive deal. And is Angela in the room? But there was a paper that, yeah, you are, that was in the IQVIA conference. There was a paper published in Nature by Janet Woodcock from the FDA that said that only 5% of trials, therapeutic trials for COVID that were run in the States, were actually generated data which was actionable and controlled and of sufficient value. 5% of trials. So if you think that 95% of people that enrolled in trials in the US didn't generate any actionable data, that's a phenomenal waste. Whereas if you see what nothing to do with me, but the recovery study, what they were able to do was to be able to fundamentally alter the course of how COVID was treated. First with dexamethasone, then tocilizumab, and also importantly, all the things that didn't work. So I do think that the sort of the clinical trial activity in the UK is on a real high. So I don't think we're going to need a lot of persuading to get people to engage.
So MHRA has changed partly through people were talking and no one could see any benefits of Brexit in the last panel. I see Paul in front of me. Possibly that was a minor positive against all the negatives, the way the MHRA has changed Brexit.
Yes, I think so. We faced I think the MHRA faced a huge issue, which was, do we really think pharmaceutical companies are going to file with, FDA, EMA, and then the MHRA, for a tiny little, we're 3% of the global market? And I think the answer was, they will come to UK if we can actually get them first real-world evidence. So first of all, if you can get the trial run and recruited and the data out quicker than anywhere else. Remember, we've all got NHS records. You can dive back in to really curate the data that's of the patients that are contributing to the trial. And then if you can show the real-world data, again, pharmacovigilance, which is a bit everyone sort of forgets about, but you have to actually follow, once a drug is launched or a vaccine is launched, follow to see what's going on. And that, again, we are in a good position. So I think MHRA was a huge opportunity for us. And it could have gone either way. We could have just been, you're too small, you're trivial, and nobody cares. Where, in fact, it's gone the other way, which is you're fundamentally important, and now people are really looking at how are clinical trials run. And, when you get papers in Nature written by Janet Woodcock at the FDA saying this is what's happened in the US, that's pretty, it's not good.
What does the NHS need to do to help this process along?
They've got to buy new drugs. It's very straightforward. So there does need to be a patient access approach that allows novel drugs to actually get taken up. There's no good us being able to test them and evaluate them and show they're safe and effective if no one ever gets to use them. And that is a fundamental issue we've got at the moment.
Right. I did promise that I'd talk about something that's slightly further away from the pandemic. Can you say briefly, taking the longer view over your time in venture capital, what's changed most? Obviously, there have been huge changes in one generation, but what have you seen that's most striking, perhaps surprising?
Well, there's lots of different layers on that. So the single biggest change to my job is that we've moved away from funding drugs which are symptomatic to actually getting to the underlying cause of the disease. So that move towards sort of a precision medicine and understanding the biological mechanisms of disease, that I would say, that's not us particularly, but that is the whole world. That is fundamentally different. Fundamentally different is the engagement of big industry with small innovation. And, there was a time when every VC that ever got on the stage would say, Big Pharma doesn't know what it's doing and blah, blah, blah. That's just not true. But small companies do provide an incredibly powerful engine of innovation, which is being recognised and largely incredibly constructively partnered with major industry. So, and that is a huge issue. Again, 20 years ago or longer, you know, we'd have to get on our knees to get pharma to ever take a meeting with us, let alone look at what we were doing. So that has changed radically. Funding has changed hugely. So when we set up Kudos, for example, that we pretty much ran out of steam in terms of being able to continue to fund the company, because we'd raised, I don't know, 40 or 50 million by then, and there was no ability to take the company public. We could have licensed, but that was no obvious way to build the broader company. So we ended up selling. Now that is very different from Artios, which has now raised a different order of magnitude of cash, and now we have a dual track now potentially to take the company public on NASDAQ in a way that we never were able to before. So we still suffer from low access to finance compared with the States. If you look at sort of R&D spend versus sort of entrepreneurial dollar, we're still way behind. Relatively, we're less way behind on the early funding than we are on the later funding, so we need to plug that gap, but that's way better than it was. And I think generally the entrepreneurship in the UK is stronger. Do I think it's perfect? No, but there were plenty of times, 30 years ago, where you'd go and talk to academics and they would publish very freely before they thought about patenting. That still happens, but much, much less frequently. So I think the UK now is a pretty exciting place to be.
You use the phrase we've heard so often over the years, take the company public on NASDAQ, speaking about a British or a European company. Does that matter if its main activities are on this side of the Atlantic, it's R&D and other activities? Do we need to bring them to LSE and the European exchanges as a long-term goal or not?
It would make wear and tear easier on the CEOs, but I don't think so. I think you can build your companies here, but you raise your money elsewhere. I think that's doable. Certainly, it needs to be doable, because that's the only way our company's going to raise enough money. But I don't think it's any time soon that we're going to have, the LSE will be as rich a stock market as NASDAQ.
Before I hope you'll have some questions in a minute, but I want to ask Kate before that about the Dementia Discovery Fund, which has been running now for 6 years. And then we had this announcement today about, as you say, 375 million for neurodegenerative diseases, some of which cause dementia. What's your view of the state of play on dementia drug discovery and development?
Well, again, we've seen a lot more cash and investors coming into the sector. There's no lack of opportunity, by and large. The biggest issue in this space is lack of translational models. So that was the biggest issue that caused so much to fail in the whole sort of amyloid beta cascade, because there were lots of drugs that were fantastic at removing plaques from mice brains, but didn't actually do anything in the clinic. And aducanumab, the jury's somewhat out as to whether or not that drug actually does anything clinically. But it does help to have an approved drug, even though it's clearly not a game-changing drug. At least it is helping bringing more cash back into the sector and a greater focus on neuro. So, I think cancer is pretty well richly funded now, and I think people are looking as, what are the next areas in which to invest? And I think neuro is definitely part of it, not broader than just neurodegeneration, so I think I would include mental health. And then broadly sort of diseases of aging, which is also included in dementia. So one of our goals was to explore new mechanisms and bring cash into the sector so that you could really develop those drugs further. And I think we've done that. We've got plenty of failures and some interesting companies coming through. So far, so good, I'd say.
Thank you. Amber was giving me a hand signal, and I haven't... Oh, right. Have I overrun? Oops, sorry. I apologise. One killer last question from the floor, if there is one.
I've got a killer.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Peter.
On behalf of us all at our age group, I'd just like to formally say thank you for all your hard, unpaid work that you did. I've had my 3 vaccines, and I'm very grateful for that. One question I actually had was, there was a bit of negative press, which would have been new to you in your celebrity status. How did you actually react to that? And then the final killer one was that if ever invited to go on to I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, would you accept?
Yeah, so the easy one is no to that. And what I did on the sort of, I mean, luckily all that press briefing happened basically at the tail end of my time. So had that happened at the beginning, I think it would have been a different answer. But basically everything had been done at that point. And so I knew we'd done a good job. And so I wasn't concerned that there was any truth. But it is annoying. And so actually Steve Bates was very helpful. And he basically said, look, take your ego out of it. Just doesn't matter. Just get on with it. Keep your head down. Do a good job. And, you know, don't let it distract you. And then my daughter introduced me to a song that was rather rude, a Lily Allen song, about what you should say to people who are not very nice to you. So I would go for a run and plug in listening to this. And that was actually quite therapeutic, actually.
Thank you for asking that, Peter, because Amber wanted me to ask it and I didn't. Now, I'm going to hand over to you, Amber, but thank you, Kate. I'm sorry I spoke too long, but it's been a great conversation.
Brilliant, thank you, as always.
Thank you, Kate and Clive. It's great for us at Consilium to have our two wonderful friends up on this stage. I would say it was incredibly interesting and, dare I say it, fun, apart from the negative media which we watched happen, and it was not nice for you. It's always exhilarating listening to Kate tell your story of your leadership role on the vaccine task force. And as Peter quite rightly said, thank you on behalf of all of us and the word society that we've heard talked about today. Thank you very much for everything you've done for us. Thanks for your time this afternoon as well. Clive, thank you to you also for your time, and to you and your team at the FT. Obviously, Hannah was with us today, but your team through the COVID era, reporting on everything outside COVID as well. We saw all your stories pour out. You've worked incredibly hard for us all as well. So thank you very much with your very balanced, brilliant reporting. I've enjoyed all the other panels as well a great deal this afternoon. I think what we have heard from all the content on the panels is that we have a very buoyant global healthcare sector. It's very strong, it's now even more nimble. The word speed has popped up so much, and we've seen the industry move with great speed. And I am incredibly proud, and of course of Consilium, for being very much part of this global healthcare space. I want to thank all of the panel speakers that spoke today, our sponsors and the Consilium team, who have been preparing not just one conference, this physical one that we're in the room today, but also the virtual one, which at the break, one of our wonderful workers was able to tell me was running extremely smoothly. So 2 conferences have been running. It's taken a huge amount of preparation, so well done to everybody on the Consilium team for doing that. For people listening on the virtual track, thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon. For everybody else in the room, there are going to be some drinks and refreshments served outside. Thanks very much for joining us. It's fantastic to be in a room together, and I wish everybody a very safe journey home. Thank you.